A dirt-stained envelope buried beneath a playground. Inside, photographs of people who vanished. A handwritten map with names circled in red. And one sentence at the bottom that turned a quiet biker's blood cold. If a child finds this, it means they have started again. 11-year-old Lily Bennett didn't understand what she'd uncovered. But Cade Mercer did. Because 8 years ago, a man tried to expose a trafficking ring in the town of Blackridge and disappeared before dawn. Now someone had hidden the proof where only an innocent hand would ever dig. And the people responsible? They were still here, wearing suits, teaching children, running this town. If you think you know where this story is going, you don't. Stay until the very end, because what Cade finds in that envelope will unravel everything Blackridge was built on. Drop a like right now. Comment your city so I know where you're watching from, and whatever you do, don't stop listening. The autumn wind in Blackridge carried the smell of dead leaves and diesel fuel, and it cut through the gaps in Cade Mercer's leather jacket like a knife looking for something soft. He sat on the bench outside Harlan's diner at the edge of town, a cup of black coffee going cold between his scarred hands, watching the street do what it always did, nothing. Pickup trucks crawling past, a dog tied to a parking meter licking its own reflection in a rain puddle, the blinking yellow traffic light at the corner of Main and Ridgeway that hadn't worked properly since the last mayor promised to fix it, and then got re-elected without fixing a single thing. Cade was 44. He looked 55. His face was leather before the jacket was, sun-cracked and wind-beaten and carrying the kind of lines that didn't come from laughter. His knuckles were permanently swollen, 2 fingers on his left hand slightly crooked from a field reset he'd done himself in Helmand Province 17 years ago because the medic was dead and the convoy wasn't stopping. His hair was dark, streaked gray at the temples, pulled back and tied with a black cord that had once been a bootlace. He had a scar across the bridge of his nose and another one hidden beneath his collar that ran from his left shoulder to the middle of his chest. He never talked about either. He'd come to Blackridge 3 years ago because it was the kind of town nobody came to. That was the point. He fixed motorcycles in a rented bay behind a tire shop on Route 12. He didn't advertise. People found him the way people found things in small towns, by asking the right person at the wrong bar. He was good with engines, better with silence. He paid his rent on time, kept no pets, attended no meetings, and had exactly one photograph in his entire apartment. A faded snapshot of a boy in a baseball cap standing in front of a blue house, taped to the inside of his toolbox lid where nobody would ever see it. Nobody in Blackridge knew what that photograph meant, and Cade intended to keep it that way. The coffee was bitter. He drank it anyway. The afternoon was doing that thing small-town afternoons do when the season turns, getting darker too early, like the sky was in a hurry to leave. Across the street, the elementary school was emptying. Yellow buses lined up along the curb, exhaust plumes drifting in the cold. Kids spilled out through the double doors in that chaotic, screaming, backpack-bouncing way that always made Cade's jaw tighten. Not because he didn't like children, but because the sound reminded him of something he'd spent a long time learning how to forget. He was about to stand and leave when he saw her. She was small, thin in the way that wasn't athletic, but wasn't right either. The kind of thin that came from skipping meals nobody noticed she skipped. Her coat was too big. Her shoes were scuffed at the toes. Her brown hair hung past her shoulders in tangled strands that hadn't seen a brush since morning. She was walking alone, not toward the buses, not toward a waiting car, but across the street, directly toward him. She stopped about 8 feet away. Her hands were behind her back. Her eyes were huge, dark brown, red-rimmed, and holding the kind of stillness Cade had only ever seen in 2 kinds of people, trained snipers and terrified children. "You fix motorcycles," she said. It wasn't a question. Cade studied her. The wind pushed her coat against her body, and she didn't flinch. She was shivering, but she wasn't flinching. There was a difference. "Sometimes," he said. "My name's Lily," she said. "Lily Bennett." He waited. She pulled her hands from behind her back. She was holding a manila envelope, dirt-stained and creased, the edges soft with moisture. It was the color of old skin. One corner had been torn and taped back together with the kind of clear tape they kept in school supply closets. Her small fingers were gripping it so tightly the knuckles had gone white. "I found this hidden in the playground," she said. Under the mulch, by the broken fence near the creek. Cade looked at the envelope, then at her, then at the street behind her. No one was watching, or rather, no one appeared to be watching. "Why are you bringing it to me?" She blinked. "Because Mrs. Coulter told me to throw it away." Something in Cade's chest moved. A cold click, like a safety being disengaged. "Your teacher told you to throw it away." Lily nodded. "She saw me digging. She came over really fast. She said it was probably garbage and told me to put it in the trash. She said it twice." The girl paused. "People don't say things twice unless they're lying." Cade almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he set down his coffee cup, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and held out his hand. Lily placed the envelope in his palm like she was handing over something that burned. It was heavier than it should have been. He could feel objects shifting inside, something stiff, something that crinkled. He slid his thumb under the torn flap and opened it. What he found inside changed the temperature of the air around him. 4 photographs. Faded. Taken with an old film camera. The first showed a man standing in front of a white van, license plate partially visible, parked near a building Cade recognized. The old Ridgemont processing plant at the edge of town, shut down years ago. The man's face was turned slightly away. In the second photograph, 2 men in business suits sat across from each other at a table covered in cash and manila folders. The third photograph showed a hallway with numbered doors. A motel, maybe, or something worse, with a child's shoe visible on the floor just inside one of the open doorways. Cade stopped breathing. The fourth photograph was a map. Hand-drawn. Detailed. A map of Black Ridge with 7 locations marked in red circles, each annotated with initials. Some of the initials Cade didn't recognize. 2 of them he did, initials he'd seen on the plaques outside the town hall and the Black Ridge Business Association building. Beneath the photographs was a single folded letter, handwritten in ink that had faded to the color of dried blood. The handwriting was precise, controlled, but toward the bottom of the page it grew unsteady, rushed, desperate. Cade read the first lines and his throat closed. The letter was written by someone named Daniel Hargrove. It was dated 8 years ago. Cade had never heard the name, but the letter read like a man writing his own epitaph. Hargrove described himself as a former clerk at the Black Ridge Municipal Office who had stumbled upon financial irregularities connected to a child trafficking operation run by people embedded in the town's power structure. He named names. He described transactions. He detailed how victims were moved through legitimate businesses, dry cleaners, motels, construction sites, and how anyone who asked questions was silenced through intimidation, buyouts, or disappearance. The final paragraph said Hargrove had attempted to bring his evidence to 3 separate authorities. Local police had refused to file his report. The county DA's office had returned his documents unopened. A state investigator had visited once, asked 4 questions, and never returned. Hargrove wrote that he'd been followed for weeks, that his car had been broken into, that someone had left a dead animal on his porch with a note pinned to its neck. He buried the envelope in the playground because he believed it was the last place they would look. At the bottom, underlined twice, "If a child finds this, it means they have started again." Cade sat very still. The sounds of the street, the buses, the wind, the blinking traffic light, became thin and distant, like sounds heard underwater. His hands did not shake. His face did not change. But something behind his eyes shifted in a way that anyone who'd served with him would have recognized immediately. It was the look he got before missions that didn't have extraction plans. He looked up at Lily. She was still standing there, watching him with those huge red-rimmed eyes. "You read this?" he asked. She shook her head. "I can't read cursive that well. I looked at the pictures." Her voice dropped. "There's a kid's shoe in one of them." Cade folded the letter, slid everything back into the envelope, pressed it flat against his thigh. His mind was already running sequences. Who to call, who not to call, what this meant if even half of it was true. "Lily, does anyone else know you found this?" "Just Mrs. Coulter." "Did you tell your parents?" Something crossed the girl's face, fast and dark, like a cloud passing over a field. "My mom works nights. She's sleeping. My dad doesn't live with us anymore." Cade heard what she didn't say. He'd spent 22 years listening to the things people left out of sentences. The pause before "doesn't live with us anymore" carried weight, not grief, but relief. That told him everything. What about friends, other kids? "I don't really have friends." She said it the way you'd say, "I don't really have allergies." Flat, informational. A fact she'd accepted so long ago it didn't even hurt anymore, which meant it hurt worse than anything. Cade stood. He was 6'2" and built like a man who'd spent decades using his body as a tool and a weapon. Next to him, Lily looked impossibly small. The wind snapped at her oversized coat. She didn't step back. "Go home," he said. "Lock the door. Don't tell anyone you came here. Don't tell anyone about the envelope." "Are you going to help?" He looked down at her. In 17 years of military service and 3 years of deliberate isolation, Cade Mercer had perfected the art of walking away. He'd walked away from friendships, from commands, from a marriage that lasted 14 months and ended with the door closing so quietly it was louder than any explosion. He'd walked away from the blue house and the photograph taped inside his toolbox. He was good at walking away. He was an expert. "Go home, Lily." She turned and left without another word. She didn't look back. She crossed the street with her hands in her coat pockets and her head down, and she disappeared around the corner of the pharmacy on 2nd Street, and then she was gone. Cade stood there for a long time. The coffee was ice cold. The sun was dropping behind the ridge to the west, painting the sky the color of a bruise. He looked down at the envelope in his hands. He could feel the edges of the photographs through the paper. He should burn it. That was the smart thing. Burn it, forget it, keep fixing motorcycles in the rented bay behind the tire shop and drinking bad coffee outside Harlan's diner until the next season turned and the next one after that. He'd chosen Blackridge because it was invisible, because nothing happened here, because the silence was thick enough to sleep inside without dreaming. But the letter said they'd started again, and there was a child's shoe in one of the photographs. Cade walked to his motorcycle, a matte black 2004 Harley Softail with no chrome, no polish, no markings. He threw his leg over, tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of his jacket, and sat there without starting the engine. The evening cold crept through his jeans. His breath came out in small white clouds that dissolved before they reached the handlebars. He made one phone call. It rang 4 times before a voice answered, rough, tired, like gravel poured over rust. "Yeah." "Boone, it's Cade." A pause. Then, "You still alive?" "Barely." "What do you need?" Cade closed his eyes. The wind pushed against his face, and he smelled exhaust and dead leaves, and something else, something faint and wrong, something that reminded him of the way certain buildings smelled in Fallujah when you knew what had happened inside them before you opened the door. "I need you to run a name for me. Daniel Hargrove. Blackridge, West Virginia, 8 years ago." Silence on the line. Then, "That's a cold trail." "I know." "You in trouble?" "Not yet." Another pause. Cade could hear Boone breathing. Somewhere on Boone's end, a dog barked twice and stopped. "Give me 48 hours. "You have 24. The line went dead. Cade started the engine. The Softail rumbled to life beneath him, deep, percussive, a sound that resonated in his sternum like a second heartbeat. He pulled out of the space and headed east on Route 12, past the tire shop, past the abandoned Sunoco station, past the row of bare-branched oaks that lined the road like skeletal sentries, toward the only place in Blackridge where he might find answers before someone else found him. The old Ridgemont processing plant sat at the far end of an industrial access road that hadn't been maintained in a decade. Cade killed his headlight 200 yards out and coasted in on engine sound alone. The building was massive, corrugated steel and concrete, windows broken or boarded, loading docks sealed with rusted chains. A faded sign hung crooked above the main entrance. Ridgemont Agricultural Processing, Esting, 1987. Around the perimeter, dead weeds grew waist-high through cracks in the asphalt. There was no security, no fence, no reason for anyone to come here, except someone had. Cade noticed it immediately. Fresh tire tracks in the mud near the south loading dock. 2 sets. One narrow, a sedan. One wide, a van or truck. Both recent. The mud hadn't dried yet. He parked the Softail behind a dumpster and approached on foot. His boots made no sound on the broken concrete. His hand moved instinctively to his right hip, a habit from a life he'd left behind, and found nothing. He carried no weapon. He hadn't carried one in 3 years. The therapist at the VA had said it was progress. Cade had said nothing. The south loading dock door was sealed with a chain and padlock, but the chain had been cut and re-looped to look intact. Cade lifted it, slid the door open 6 inches, and slipped inside. Darkness. Cold. The smell of rust, old grain, and something chemical, bleach maybe. Industrial cleaner. The kind you use to remove things that weren't supposed to be there. Cade pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight, keeping it angled low, sweeping the floor. The main processing floor was empty, cavernous and echoing, with steel pillars running in rows and a concrete floor stained with years of agricultural residue. But in the far northeast corner, behind a partition wall that had been recently erected from plywood and plastic sheeting, Cade found something that made his stomach drop. A folding table. 2 metal chairs. An ashtray with fresh cigarette butts. 3 disposable cell phones still in their packaging. A stack of blank shipping labels from a freight company Cade didn't recognize. And on the wall, pinned with thumbtacks, a printed spreadsheet with rows of numbers, dates, and what appeared to be location codes. This wasn't abandoned. This was operational. Cade photographed everything with his phone. The table, the phones, the spreadsheet, the tire tracks outside. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. But his heart was beating at a rate he recognized from combat, and the edges of his vision had sharpened the way they always did when his body knew something his mind hadn't fully processed yet. He was backing toward the loading dock door when he heard it. An engine, getting closer. Then headlights, cutting through the gaps in the corrugated walls, sweeping across the interior in bright horizontal slashes. Cade killed his phone light, pressed himself flat against the steel wall beside the dock door. Listened. A vehicle pulled up outside. The engine idled. A door opened. Footsteps, 2 sets, crunching on gravel. A voice. Told you the chain looked wrong. Another voice, deeper. Probably raccoons. Raccoons don't cut chains, Dale. Cade didn't move. He didn't breathe. Through a gap in the corrugated wall, he could see 2 figures in the headlight glare. One tall and thin in a dark overcoat, the other shorter, heavier, wearing a Blackridge Police Department jacket. A cop. Cade felt the cold move through him, not from the wind, but from the recognition. The letter had said local police refused to file the report. 8 years later, they were still here, still involved, still standing in the parking lot of the same building that appeared in Daniel Hargrove's photographs. The taller man walked to the loading dock door and inspected the chain. He held it up, turning it in the headlight beam. The cut link was visible. Someone's been inside. The cop unholstered his weapon. I'll check. Cade had approximately 40 seconds to exit through the north side of the building before they came through the south dock. He moved fast and silent, the way he'd moved through compounds in Kandahar, through blown-out buildings in Ramadi, through nightmares that still woke him at 0300 with his hands gripping sheets soaked in sweat. He found a broken window on the north wall, climbed through it without cutting himself, dropped 6 feet to the muddy ground, and moved low along the exterior wall toward his motorcycle. He reached the Softail, didn't start the engine, walked it 200 yards down the access road in the dark, boots scraping asphalt, arms burning from the weight, until he reached the tree line. Only then did he swing on, kick it to life, and pull onto Route 12 with no headlight, riding by moonlight and memory. 2 miles out, he pulled over beneath an overpass and sat there in the dark, breathing hard. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from adrenaline finding nowhere to go. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photographs he'd taken. The spreadsheet, the dates, the shipping labels. Then he pulled out the envelope and read Daniel Hargrove's letter again, slowly, word by word, in the blue glow of his phone screen. Hargrove had tried to do the right thing. He'd gone to the police. He'd gone to the DA. He'd gone to the state. And every door had closed in his face. Every institution designed to protect people had looked the other way. And then Daniel Hargrove had disappeared. Not dramatically, not publicly, but the way people disappear in small towns. Quietly. Completely. until nobody remembers to ask where they went. And now an 11-year-old girl with no friends and an oversized coat had dug up the only evidence that any of it ever happened. Cade put the envelope back inside his jacket. He stared at the darkness beneath the overpass. A truck passed above, shaking the concrete, sending vibrations through his spine. He'd come to Blackridge to disappear. Now he was the only person standing between a buried truth and the people who'd kill to keep it underground. His phone buzzed. A text from a blocked number. 4 words. "We know she found it." Cade read it twice. Then he deleted it, started the engine, and rode toward Lily Bennett's house at a speed that turned the autumn night into a black, roaring blur. Because whoever sent that message wasn't warning him. They were telling him they were already on their way. Cade pushed the Softail past 90 on Route 12, the engine screaming beneath him like something wounded and furious. The cold air hit his face in solid sheets, numbing his cheeks, forcing his eyes into slits. Streetlights blurred into orange streaks. The center line dissolved into a continuous ribbon of white. He leaned into each curve with the kind of reckless precision that only came from years of riding in conditions where hesitation meant death. Desert roads with no shoulders, mountain passes in Afghanistan where the drop was 1,000 feet, and the Taliban had the high ground, midnight convoys where the only light was muzzle flash. Lily Bennett's house was on Persimmon Lane, a dead-end street on the south side of Blackridge, where the houses were small and close together, and the porches sagged under the weight of years nobody bothered to count. Cade knew the street because he'd driven past it once on a parts run, noticed the way the streetlights stopped halfway down the block, and filed it in the mental map he kept of every town he'd ever lived in, a habit from reconnaissance work that he couldn't shut off even when he wanted to. He killed the engine 2 houses away and coasted to a stop at the curb. The neighborhood was quiet. A television flickered blue behind a curtained window across the street. A cat sat motionless on a fence post, watching him with reflective eyes. Lily's house was the third from the end, a 1-story bungalow with peeling white paint, a cracked concrete walkway, and a porch light that was burned out. No cars in the driveway, no lights inside. The front door was closed. Cade swung off the bike and moved up the walkway. His boots were loud on the concrete, too loud, and he shifted his weight to the balls of his feet, an old habit that surfaced whenever the air tasted wrong. He reached the porch. The wooden boards creaked under him. He knocked twice, waited, knocked again. Nothing. He tried the doorknob, locked. He moved to the side of the house, found a window that was cracked open an inch, and listened. From inside, very faintly, he heard breathing, quick, shallow, the breathing of someone trying very hard not to make a sound. "Lily," he said, keeping his voice low. "It's Cade, the motorcycle guy." Silence. Then a sound, small, involuntary, a whimper swallowed before it could fully form. "I'm not going to hurt you. I need to know you're safe." A pause. Then her voice, barely above a whisper. "The back door was open when I got home. I didn't leave it open." The cold inside Cade's chest turned to iron. "Where are you right now?" "The bathroom. I locked the door." "Stay there. Don't move. Don't unlock it for anyone except me." He circled to the back of the house. The rear door was ajar, 6 inches open, the frame splintered near the lock where someone had used a pry bar. Cade pushed it wide with the back of his hand and stepped into a dark kitchen that smelled like dish soap and old linoleum. He stood motionless, letting his eyes adjust. Shapes materialized. A counter, a table with 2 chairs, a refrigerator humming in the corner. A cereal bowl in the sink with a spoon still in it. Nothing moved. But someone had been here. He could feel it the way you feel a room that's been disturbed. The air holding the ghost of recent motion, the subtle displacement of ordinary things. A drawer was half open that should have been closed. A stack of papers on the counter had been shifted. The bathroom door at the end of the hallway had light leaking from beneath it. A flashlight, not an overhead, which meant Lily had been sitting in the dark before she turned it on. He cleared the house the way he'd cleared 100 buildings in 2 wars, methodically, silently, room by room. 2 bedrooms. A living room with a couch that had a blanket thrown over a broken spring. A closet with coats and shoes. Empty. All of it. Whoever had been here was gone. But they'd left something. On the kitchen table, placed deliberately in the exact center, was a single playing card, the ace of spades. On its face, someone had written in black marker, "Return it." Cade picked it up, turned it over. Nothing on the back. He slid it into his pocket and walked to the bathroom door. "Lily, it's clear. You can come out." The lock clicked. The door opened 3 inches. One brown eye appeared in the gap, enormous, wet. "Is anyone still here?" "No." She opened the door fully. She was still wearing her coat. She'd been crying, not the noisy kind, the silent kind, the kind that leaves tracks but no sound, the kind children learn when noise brings the wrong kind of attention. Cade crouched down to her eye level. He'd never been good at this. Gentleness was a language he'd learned too late and practiced too rarely, and it always came out slightly wrong, too stiff, too formal, like a man reading from a manual he'd memorized but didn't believe. "Where's your mom?" "Night shift. She works at the bottling plant on Highway 9. She leaves at 5 and comes back at 2. "Does she have a phone?" Lily nodded. "Call her. Tell her you're going to stay at a friend's house tonight." "I told you I don't have friends." The words hit Cade somewhere beneath his ribs. He exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled. He looked at the broken back door, at the playing card in his pocket, at this girl standing in a cold hallway in a house that someone had already breached. "You do now," he said, and hated himself for saying it because he knew what promises cost, and he'd broken enough of them to fill a graveyard. 20 minutes later, Cade's Softail rumbled down a gravel road 3 miles outside Blackridge, Lily sitting behind him with her arms locked around his waist and her face pressed against the back of his jacket. The wind was sharp, and the road was dark, and the trees on either side formed a canopy of bare branches that looked like cracks in a black ceiling. The compound appeared around a bend, a cluster of low buildings behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, centered around a corrugated steel workshop with 2 bays and a flat-roofed cinder block structure that served as the clubhouse for the Iron Vale MC. A single floodlight illuminated the gate. 3 motorcycles were parked in a row outside the main door. 2 Road Kings and a Dyna, all black, all stripped of unnecessary chrome. Cade stopped at the gate. A figure emerged from the shadows beside it, tall, thin, wearing a canvas jacket over a faded military hoodie. He had a shaved head, a thick beard going gray, and a prosthetic left leg that clicked faintly when he walked. His name was Dutch, and he'd been Cade's spotter in Helmand Province before an IED took everything below his left knee and most of his faith in the country that sent him there. Dutch looked at the motorcycle, then at the small figure clinging to the back of it. "Cade." "Dutch. That's a child. I know what she is." "You know what time it is?" "I know what time it is." Dutch studied him for a long moment. Then he opened the gate without another word and stepped aside. Inside the clubhouse, the air was thick with the smell of motor oil, cigarette smoke, and coffee that had been on the burner since morning. The main room was sparse, a long wooden table scarred with cigarette burns and knife marks, a row of metal folding chairs, a workbench against the far wall, and a wood-burning stove in the corner that was putting out enough heat to make the windows fog. A Confederate flag had been taken down and replaced with nothing, just a rectangle of wall slightly less faded than the rest. Sometime after Boone had joined. 3 men sat at the table. Cade knew all of them. Boone was at the head, a black man in his late 40s with hands the size of dinner plates and eyes that had seen the inside of 3 combat zones and 2 federal prisons. He'd been a Marine staff sergeant before a dishonorable discharge for striking an officer who'd ordered an airstrike on a building full of civilians. The discharge was later reversed on appeal, but by then Boone had already stopped believing in institutional justice. He wore a leather vest with the Iron Vale patch, a shield split by a vertical blade, and beneath it, a thermal shirt with the sleeves pushed up, revealing forearms covered in burn scars that he never explained. To his left sat Roach, real name Martin Kessler, a wiry, pale, restless man in his mid-30s who'd been an Army intelligence analyst before a heroin addiction destroyed his clearance and most of his relationships. He'd been clean for 4 years, but he still carried the look. Hollow cheekbones, fingernails bitten to the quick, eyes that moved too fast and landed nowhere. He was the smartest person in any room he entered and the least comfortable. Across from Roach was Gravel, a wide, silent Choctaw man with a flat face and no visible expression, who'd served as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne and now spoke fewer than 40 words a day by deliberate choice. He had a leather cord around his neck with a small brass ring on it, a wedding band from a marriage that ended when his wife took their daughter to Tulsa and told him not to follow. He hadn't followed. That was 6 years ago. Boone looked up when Cade walked in. His eyes went to Lily, who was standing just inside the door with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the room the way a stray animal looks at a space it isn't sure is safe. "No," Boone said. "Boone, whatever this is, the answer is no. We don't do this anymore. We had a vote. We agreed." Cade pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed the envelope on the table. "Read it." Boone didn't move. His eyes stayed on Cade. The two men had a history that went back 19 years. Helmand, Ramadi, Walter Reed, a halfway house in Baltimore, a bar fight in Richmond that left Boone with a cracked orbital bone, and Cade with a dislocated shoulder, and finally Blackridge, where they'd both come to stop running and ended up finding each other instead. They'd built the Iron Veil together, not as a gang, not as a club in the chrome and leather fetish sense, but as a foxhole. A place where men who'd been chewed up and spit out by the machine could sit in a room together and not have to explain why they couldn't sleep. The Iron Veil had helped people before. Quietly. Unofficially. A woman whose ex-husband kept showing up at her apartment, a teenager being extorted by a dealer, an elderly veteran whose landlord was stealing his disability checks. Small interventions. Local justice. Nothing that attracted attention. But 6 months ago, something had gone wrong. An operation to protect a family from a stalker had escalated when Roach, still fragile, had overreacted, put the stalker in a hospital with a broken jaw and 3 cracked ribs. The family had been scared of the club afterward. The police had come asking questions. Boone had called a vote. No more outside operations. The Iron Veil was a garage, a clubhouse, and a brotherhood, not a militia. The vote had been unanimous. Cade had voted yes. And now he was sitting at the table with a dirt-stained envelope and a child who had nowhere else to go. "Read it," Cade said again. Boone exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who recognized the sound of a door opening that couldn't be closed. He picked up the envelope, pulled out the contents, and began reading. The room went silent. The stove crackled. Roach leaned forward, his knee bouncing under the table. Dutch stood by the door, arms crossed, watching Lily with an expression Cade couldn't read. Gravel didn't move at all. He sat like stone, his eyes on the table, listening. Boone read the letter. Then he looked at the photographs. He spent a long time on the third one, the hallway with numbered doors and the child's shoe on the floor. His jaw tightened. The tendons in his neck stood out. He set the photographs down and placed both hands flat on the table, fingers spread. "Where'd you get this?" "She found it." Cade nodded toward Lily. "Buried in the playground at Black Ridge Elementary." Boone looked at Lily. His expression softened, just barely, just enough to recognize, and then hardened again. "You take it to the police?" "A cop was at the building tonight, Boone, in a department jacket, standing next to a man who fits the description of one of the names in that letter. They're inside this." Roach picked up the spreadsheet photograph from the table and angled it toward the light. His eyes, those fast, restless eyes, began scanning the numbers. His knee stopped bouncing. "These are transfer codes," he said quietly. "Freight forwarding. I've seen this format before. Military logistics adapted for commercial shipping. Someone with training set this up." "How many names on the map?" Dutch asked from the door. 7, Cade said. "I recognize 2. One is on the town council, the other runs the business association." The room absorbed this like a body absorbing a blow. Boone stood. He walked to the stove, picked up the coffee pot, poured a cup he didn't drink, and set it on the edge of the stove. He stood there with his back to the room, and Cade could see the muscles in his shoulders working beneath his thermal shirt, nodding and unknodding like a man having an argument with himself. "We voted," Boone said without turning around. "I know. You stood in this room 6 months ago and said, 'I agree.' You looked me in the eye and said it. I know what I said. And now you're bringing a child into this building at 11 o'clock at night with evidence that implicates half the power structure of this town, and you're asking me to..." What? Go to war? I'm asking you to look at that photograph again. Boone turned. His eyes were wet. Not crying. Boone didn't cry, but wet in the way that happened when something got past the armor and touched the thing underneath. He picked up the photograph of the hallway with the numbered doors and held it at arm's length, as if proximity might damage him. Don't do this to me, Cade. I'm not doing anything. A dead man did this 8 years ago, and nobody listened. Silence. Long. Waited. The kind of silence that fills a room the way water fills a sinking ship, slowly, steadily, until everything is submerged. Gravel spoke. It was the first time he'd spoken since Cade had arrived. His voice was deep, quiet, with the cadence of a man who rationed words because he understood their cost. The girl stays tonight. Everyone looked at him. She sleeps in the back room. We figure this out in the morning. He paused. Anyone who disagrees can tell me. Nobody disagreed. Cade led Lily to the back room, a small, windowless space with a cot, a wool blanket, and a space heater that ticked when it cycled on. It had been Gravel's room during the months when the nightmares were bad enough that he couldn't be around people. There was nothing on the walls. Nothing personal. Just the cot and the blanket and the heater and the concrete floor. Lily stood in the doorway, looking at the room. It's not pretty, Cade said. My room at home isn't pretty either. She walked in and sat on the edge of the cot. The blanket was rough, and she pulled it over her legs without being told. She looked up at him. Are those men your friends? Cade leaned against the doorframe. They're my brothers. Brothers fight. Yeah, they do. The big one, Boone, he doesn't want to help. He wants to help. He's just afraid of what helping costs. Lily pulled the blanket up to her chest. Her eyes were heavy now, exhaustion catching up to fear the way it always did. I'm afraid too, she said, but I still brought you the envelope. Cade stood there for a moment, unable to speak. Then he reached inside the room and pulled the door halfway closed. Get some sleep. Cade? Yeah. Thank you for not throwing it away. He closed the door. Back in the main room, the argument had already started. We can't keep her here, Dutch was saying, his prosthetic clicking as he paced. We're 4 vets with records. One of us has a federal jacket. We keep an 11-year-old overnight, and it doesn't matter what's in that envelope. We're the story, not the evidence. Us. Dutch is right, Roach said. He was standing now, chewing the inside of his cheek. I ran 2 years of counter-intel analysis. First thing an embedded network does when exposed is redirect the narrative. We become 4 dangerous bikers who abducted a child. That's the headline. Everything else disappears. So what do you suggest? Cade said. Send her home? To a house someone already broke into? With a mother who works nights and a father who's gone? We contact CPS. CPS in this county is run through the municipal office, the same municipal office that's on that map. Cade's voice was flat, controlled, but the anger underneath was tectonic, slow-moving and capable of destroying everything above it. Daniel Hargrove tried the system, every part of it, and he vanished. That was 8 years ago, and a cop was at that building tonight. Cade turned to Boone. You ran the name. Tell them what you found. Boone was sitting again. He'd been silent since the argument began, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup he still hadn't drunk from. He looked up. His face was older than it had been an hour ago. Daniel Hargrove, Boone said, age 38, municipal records clerk, filed a missing persons report on himself. The room stopped. What? Dutch said. He went to the state police barracks in Martinsburg 2 days before he disappeared, told them he believed his life was in danger. They took the report, assigned a case number. Nobody followed up. Boone paused. The report was sealed 6 months later. Reason given, administrative closure, subject voluntarily relocated. He didn't relocate, Cade said. No, Boone agreed. He didn't. Roach's knee was bouncing again. Who sealed the report? Boone looked at him. County Prosecutor's Office, authorized by the Assistant DA. He let that sit for a moment. His name is Gerald Whitfield. He's now the sitting DA for Blackridge County. The stove crackled. Wind rattled the corrugated steel walls. Somewhere outside, one of the motorcycles ticked as its engine cooled. a tiny metallic sound that was somehow louder than everything else. "So the man who buried the missing persons report," Roach said slowly, "is now the chief law enforcement authority for the county." "Yes. And the cop at the building tonight was wearing a BPD jacket. I didn't get a face, but he was armed, and he wasn't there to investigate. He was there to check." Roach sat down. He put his head in his hands. His fingers dug into his scalp and stayed there. "This is too big," he said. "This is too big for us." "It was too big for Hargrove, too," Cade said. "And he tried alone." "We're not saviors, Cade." Roach looked up. His eyes were raw. "We're broken men in a garage. I was shooting heroin in gas station bathrooms 3 years ago. Dutch can't sleep without a light on. Gravel hasn't spoken to his daughter in 6 years. He stopped himself. The room held its breath. "Say it," Cade said. Roach shook his head. "Say it, Roach." "You had a son." Roach's voice cracked on the word. "You had a boy. And you couldn't save him. And that's what this is about. That's what this has always been about. Every kid we ever helped, every woman we ever protected, it was never about them. It was about the one you lost." The silence that followed was absolute. No stove. No wind. No ticking engine. Just the sound of something breaking inside a room full of men who'd spent their entire lives learning how to not let things break. Cade didn't move. His face didn't change. But his hands, his scarred, swollen, crooked-fingered hands, gripped the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned. "His name was Emmett," Cade said. Very quiet. Very steady. "He was 7. He drowned in a creek behind our house while I was on my 3rd deployment. My wife called me on a satellite phone and told me while I was sitting in a Humvee in Kandahar eating an MRE. He paused. "I finished the MRE because I didn't know what else to do." Nobody spoke. "So yeah, maybe that's what this is about. Maybe every kid I've ever helped is a kid I couldn't help when it mattered." He let go of the table, straightened. "But there's still a girl in that back room who dug up evidence of a trafficking ring that's operating in this town right now. And there's still a playing card on a kitchen table that says someone knows she has it and is willing to break into her house to get it back." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the ace of spades, placed it on the table next to the envelope. The black marker letters, "Return it," gleamed under the overhead light. "So you can vote. Again. You can say no. Again. And I will walk out that door with her and handle this alone. I've done harder things alone." He looked around the table, at each man, slowly. "But I'm asking you, not as a president, not as a brother, as a man who buried his son's baseball cap because they never found the body. I'm asking you to help me make sure that what happened to Emmett, what happened to Daniel Hargrove, what's happening right now to children whose names we don't even know yet, I'm asking you to help me make it stop." Boone closed his eyes. Dutch stopped pacing. Roach wiped his face with both hands. Gravel reached across the table, picked up the playing card, turned it over in his thick fingers, and looked at Cade with eyes that had seen men die on operating tables in desert field hospitals and had never once looked away. "I'll need my medical kit," Gravel said. "If we're doing this, someone's going to bleed." Boone opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling for 5 full seconds. Then he lowered his gaze to the table, to the envelope, to the photographs, to the child's shoe barely visible in the corner of a picture taken 8 years ago in a hallway that should never have existed. "No vote," Boone said. His voice was hoarse. "This doesn't go to a vote. A vote means someone can say no, and nobody in this room gets to say no to this." He picked up his coffee cup, drank it in one long swallow, set it down. "What do we need?" Cade exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. "Roach, I need you to decode that spreadsheet. Freight routes, destinations, dates, everything." Roach nodded. His hands were still shaking, but his eyes had steadied. "Dutch, I need you to find out who owns the Ridgemont plant now. Corporate filings, transfers, shell companies. Follow the paper." Dutch pulled out a battered laptop from beneath the workbench. "Gravel, watch the girl. Nobody comes near her." Gravel stood, walked to the back room door, pulled a folding chair from the wall, and sat down in front of it. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The chair was a barricade. His body was a wall. "And me?" Boone asked. I need you to find Gerald Whitfield's home address, the DA who sealed Hargrove's report. Boone's eyes narrowed. What are you going to do? I'm going to have a conversation. At midnight? Best time for honest answers. Boone stared at him. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he knows he's stepping off a cliff and has decided the fall is worth it. Cade turned toward the door. He was 3 steps away when Boone's voice stopped him. Cade. He turned. Boone's face was hard, carved, ancient in the yellow light of the overhead bulb, but his voice carried something Cade hadn't heard in years. Not softness, but weight. The weight of a man who understood exactly what was about to happen. Emmett would be proud of you. Cade's jaw tightened, his eyes burned. He didn't speak. He walked out the door into the cold black night, swung onto the softail, and kicked the engine alive. The sound tore through the silence like a battle cry from a war nobody else could see. Behind him, inside the compound, Roach was already spreading the photographs across the table, his fingers moving fast, his mind finally doing the thing it was built to do. Dutch's laptop screen cast blue light across his face as he pulled corporate records from public databases. Gravel sat motionless in front of the backroom door, his hands on his knees, his eyes on the hallway, as immovable as geography. And in the back room, curled under a rough wool blanket on a cot that smelled like motor oil and solitude, Lily Bennett slept for the first time in 2 days, deeply, completely, with the unconscious trust of a child who had found, in the most unlikely place on earth, the thing she'd never had before. Safety. Outside, Cade rode into the darkness with the envelope against his chest and the names of 7 people burned into his memory. 7 names. 7 pillars of a town built on buried children and sealed reports and playing cards left as threats. He was halfway to Gerald Whitfield's house when his phone buzzed again. A text. Same block number as before. This time, it was a photograph. Lily's school picture, the one from this year's yearbook, the one with the forced smile and the crooked collar, printed on glossy paper and placed on what appeared to be a pillow. A pillow inside a room Cade didn't recognize. Beneath the photograph, one word typed in white text on black background. Closer. Cade's hands tightened on the grips until his knuckles cracked. The road ahead was empty and black and endless. The engine roared beneath him. The wind cut through his jacket and found the place where the envelope sat against his ribs, against the skin, against the scar that ran from his shoulder to his chest, the one he never talked about. And for one terrible moment, he felt all of it at once. The weight of the dead man's letter, the trust of a sleeping child, the fury of 4 broken soldiers who had just agreed to go to war again, and the certainty, cold, absolute, settling into his bones like winter, that whoever was sending these messages wasn't just watching. They were already inside. Cade didn't go to Gerald Whitfield's house. He turned the softail around 3 miles from the DA's address and rode back toward the compound at a speed that made the trees blur into black walls on either side of the road. The photograph of Lily's school picture on an unknown pillow had changed everything. This wasn't a network trying to recover evidence. This was a network showing him they could reach the girl whenever they wanted. The message wasn't a warning. It was a demonstration of capability. And demonstrations of capability, Cade knew from 22 years of warfare, only preceded one thing: action. He came through the compound gate at 12:47 a.m., killed the engine, and was off the bike before it stopped rocking on its kickstand. The floodlight above the gate threw hard shadows across the gravel. Rain had started. Not heavy, just a cold mist that settled on leather and steel and skin like something alive, something patient, something waiting. Gravel was still in the chair outside the backroom door. He hadn't moved. His hands were still on his knees. His eyes tracked Cade the moment he entered the clubhouse. "She's asleep," Gravel said. "Good." Cade walked past him to the main table where Roach and Dutch were working. Boone was standing at the window looking out at the rain. He turned when Cade entered. "You're back early. Thought you were having a conversation with the DA." Cade pulled out his phone and placed it on the table, screen up. The photograph of Lily's school picture glowed in the dim light. Everyone looked at it. Nobody spoke for a long time. "They sent this while I was riding," Cade said. "Same blocked number." Roach picked up the phone and zoomed in. His face went pale. That's not a yearbook scan. That's a physical print, photographed on a surface. Look at the shadow angle. It's on a pillow, but the pillow has a pattern, floral, institutional. He looked up. That's not someone's home. That's a hotel or a facility, somewhere with bulk linens. Can you trace the number? Blocked numbers bounce through relay services. I'd need equipment I don't have, but the image metadata. Roach grabbed Dutch's laptop and began transferring the photo. His fingers moved with the manic precision of a man whose brain was finally doing the thing addiction had tried to destroy. If they didn't strip the EXIF data, I might get GPS coordinates. Most people forget. Do it. Boone hadn't moved from the window. The rain was heavier now, streaking the glass, turning the floodlight outside into a diffused yellow smear. His reflection stared back at him. A big man, getting old, carrying weight in places that had nothing to do with his body. Cade. Yeah. When were you going to tell us about your son? Question landed in the room like a dropped blade. Roach stopped typing. Dutch went still. Even gravel behind the door seemed to shift his weight. Cade stood at the edge of the table with his hands flat on the surface, the way Boone had stood earlier. He looked at the wood, at the cigarette burns and knife marks, at the ghosts of every conversation this table had held. Roach already said it. Roach said it in anger. I'm asking you straight. 19 years I've known you. You never mentioned a son. Not once. Not drunk, not sober, not in a VA waiting room, not in this building. I told you about my sister. Dutch told you about his first marriage, Gravel. Boone stopped himself and glanced toward the back room, then quieter. We gave you everything, every broken piece of us, and you kept this. Cade's jaw worked. The tendons in his neck tightened like cables under load. Because it's mine. No, because you thought it made you weak. Maybe it does. Maybe it does. Boone crossed the room slowly, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. He stopped on the other side of the table, directly across from Cade. The two men faced each other the way they had in 100 briefings, 100 debriefs, 100 arguments in foxholes and barracks and hospital corridors. But you brought a child into this compound tonight, and you asked us to follow you into something that could get all of us killed or imprisoned. And if you're doing it because of Emmett, if this is grief dressed up as a mission, then I need to know, because grief makes men reckless, and reckless men get people dead. Cade looked up. His eyes were dry, but the things moving behind them were not. It's not just grief, he said. I read that letter, Boone. I stood in that building and saw the table and the phones and the shipping labels. I saw the cop in the parking lot. And then I went to a house where a little girl was hiding in a bathroom because someone broke in while her mother was at work. This is real. This is happening right now. And if it's also about Emmett, his voice thinned but didn't break, then maybe that's the first honest thing I've done since he died. Boone held his gaze for a long time. Then he nodded. Once. The nod of a man accepting something heavier than agreement. Okay, Boone said. Then we do this right. No cowboy operations, no midnight visits to the DA. We map the network, document everything, and find someone outside this county who'll listen. Agreed. Roach, what have you got? Roach spun the laptop around. On the screen was the spreadsheet photograph, enlarged and annotated with handwritten notes in red digital ink. The transfer codes match a freight forwarding format used by 3 regional logistics companies. 2 of them are subsidiaries of the same holding company, Ridgemont Consolidated LLC, the company that owns the processing plant. He tapped the screen. But here's where it gets ugly. Ridgemont Consolidated was dissolved on paper 4 years ago. Assets transferred to a new entity called Mountain Line Holdings. Mountain Line Holdings is registered to a P.O. box in Charleston, and its sole listed officer is a man named Frank Ober. Who's Frank Ober? Dutch asked. Nobody. That's the point. Frank Ober doesn't exist. No tax returns, no driver's license, no credit history, no social security record I can find. It's a ghost name on a ghost company holding real assets, including the building Cade was in tonight. Shell company, Cade said. Multiple shells. Nested. I traced 2 layers so far, but there are more. Someone with serious financial infrastructure set this up. This isn't local corruption, Cade. This is organized, funded, And whoever built it understood exactly how to hide money in rural jurisdictions where nobody looks. The rain intensified. It hammered the corrugated roof in a constant, relentless percussion that filled the gaps in conversation like static. Dutch was pulling property records on his own laptop, cross-referencing the locations on Hargrove's hand-drawn map with county tax assessor data. He'd been quiet for 20 minutes. Now he looked up, and his face had changed. "Cade, come look at this." Cade moved around the table. On Dutch's screen was a county property transfer record, a scanned document, yellowed, stamped with official seals. "The 7 locations on Hargrove's map," Dutch said. "I've identified 5 so far. 2 are commercial properties, the Ridgemont plant and a warehouse on Industrial Road. 1 is a residential lot on the north end of town, currently listed as vacant. 1 is a parcel of agricultural land outside the county line." He paused. "The 5th one is the Black Ridge Elementary School playground." The room went cold. "The playground," Cade repeated. "The playground is built on land that was donated to the school district 12 years ago by Ridgemont Consolidated, LLC. Before that, it was a private lot used for commercial storage. The donation was part of a community development initiative championed by—" Dutch scrolled down. "Gerald Whitfield, then a city councilman, now the county DA." Cade felt the connection snapping into place like vertebrae realigning after a fracture. The playground where Lily found the envelope was built on land donated by the same shell company that owned the processing plant. The man who championed the donation was the same man who sealed Daniel Hargrove's missing persons report. Hargrove had buried his evidence in the one location tied directly to the network's infrastructure, a location that had been transformed into a school playground, where children played every day above the buried proof of their own exploitation. The cruelty of it was architectural, deliberate, a monument built on the bones of the thing it celebrated erasing. "Hargrove knew," Cade said quietly. "He buried the envelope there on purpose. Not because it was safe, because it was symbolic. He wanted a child to find it, because a child finding evidence in a playground built by the people who—" He stopped. The sentence had nowhere to go that didn't lead to a dark room in his mind that he kept locked. Roach's laptop chimed. He turned to it fast, fingers moving. "EXIF data," he said. "The photo they sent you. They didn't strip it." His eyes scanned the screen, then they widened. "GPS coordinates. It was taken," he cross-referenced with a mapping application, "400 feet from this compound." Nobody breathed. "400 feet," Roach said again, as if repetition might change the number. "That puts it somewhere along the access road, near the tree line." Cade was already moving. He grabbed a flashlight from the workbench and went out the door into the rain. Boone followed. Dutch pulled a tire iron from under the bench and limped after them, his prosthetic clicking fast on the wet gravel. The rain was coming down hard now, cold and heavy, turning the ground to mud. The floodlight barely reached the fence line. Beyond it, the access road curved into darkness, flanked by dense pine trees that swayed and groaned in the wind. Cade swept the flashlight beam across the tree line. Water dripped from branches. Shadows shifted. 50 yards from the gate, near a cluster of thick-trunked pines, the flashlight caught something. A car, parked on the shoulder of the access road, half hidden by undergrowth. Dark green sedan. Engine off. Lights off. The driver's door was slightly ajar. Cade approached slowly, flashlight in his left hand, right hand empty, but ready. Boone flanked to the right. Dutch stayed back, covering the approach from the road. The car was empty. The interior was clean. No papers, no registration on the dash, no personal items. The keys were gone. But on the passenger seat, placed precisely in the center, was another playing card. Queen of Spades. On the back, in the same black marker, "She trusts you. That's the problem." Cade picked it up. Rain ran down his wrist, soaking the card, making the ink bleed at the edges. He looked at Boone. Boone's face was stone. Water streamed down his shaved head and into his collar, and he didn't blink. "They were here," Boone said, "while we were inside, while Gravel was guarding the door. They were 400 feet away, watching us." "They're not watching anymore," Cade said. "They left the car." "Why leave the car?" Cade looked at the sedan, then at the tree line, then back toward the compound, where the floodlight was a small yellow circle in a vast darkness. Because they wanted us to find it. They wanted us out here, in the rain, looking at an empty car. He turned fast. They wanted us away from the building. Both men ran. They covered the distance to the compound in under a minute, mud spraying from their boots, rain hammering their faces. Cade hit the clubhouse door first and threw it open. Gravel was on the floor. He was conscious but disoriented, sitting against the wall with his hand pressed to the back of his head. Blood seeped between his fingers, not gushing, but steady, dark against his brown skin. The folding chair was overturned. The backroom door was open. "Gravel." "Someone came through the workshop bay," Gravel said. His voice was thick, slightly slurred. "Didn't hear them until—" He winced. "Something hit me from behind. I went down." Cade was already through the backroom door. The cot was empty. The wool blanket was on the floor, tangled. The space heater was still ticking. The room smelled like motor oil and fear, a sharp chemical smell that children produced when terror exceeded their body's ability to process it. Lily was gone. Cade stood in the empty room. The flashlight beam trembled, not from his hands, which were steady, but from something deeper, something cellular, something that lived in the part of him that still heard a satellite phone ringing in a Humvee in Kandahar and a voice saying words that ended a world. "Cade!" Boone was behind him. "Cade, look." On the cot, where Lily's head had been, was a third playing card, King of Spades. On the back, "You should have returned it." And beneath the card, folded neatly, was the envelope. They'd taken the girl and left the evidence. The realization hit Cade like a round to the chest. They didn't want the envelope. They never wanted the envelope. The evidence, the photographs, the letter, the map, all of it was 8 years old, outdated. Names that had been shuffled, companies that had been restructured, routes that had been changed. The operation had evolved past anything Daniel Hargrove had documented. The envelope was useless to them. But Lily wasn't. Lily was a witness. Lily had found the evidence. Lily had brought it to someone. Lily could identify Mrs. Coulter, the teacher who told her to throw it away, who was now, Cade understood with sickening clarity, a pair of eyes inside the school, monitoring exactly which child touched the buried envelope and who they told. They'd let Lily find it. They'd let her bring it to Cade. They'd watched the entire chain of custody unfold, and now they were closing it. Roach appeared in the doorway. His face was gray. "I ran the car's plates. Registered to a rental company in Martinsburg. Rented 3 days ago under the name—" He stopped. "Say it." "Frank Ober." The ghost, the name on the shell company, the name that didn't exist, using it on a rental car was a message. "We're not hiding. We don't need to. We are the infrastructure." Cade walked back to the main room. Gravel was on his feet now, leaning against the wall, Dutch pressing a wadded shop towel to the wound on his head. The blood had slowed, but Gravel's eyes were unfocused, and his balance was wrong. Concussion, mild, probably, but enough to take him out of action. "How many came in?" Cade asked. "One," Gravel said. "Maybe 2. I heard one set of footsteps before I got hit, but there could have been a second in the workshop bay." "They knew the layout." Gravel nodded slowly. "They came through the side door, the one with the broken latch we never fixed." The broken latch, Cade remembered. 2 months ago, the side door to the workshop had been damaged when a delivery truck backed into it. They'd talked about replacing the latch. Boone had said he'd order the parts. The parts never came. The door stayed broken. A small failure. The kind of failure that didn't matter until it killed someone. Cade picked up his phone. His hands finally shook, not from cold, not from adrenaline, but from something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Rage. Not the hot, explosive kind. The cold kind. The kind that settled into the bone marrow and stayed there, permanent, load-bearing, the foundation for everything that came after. He dialed a number. It rang 6 times. "Do you know what time it is?" The voice was female, annoyed, groggy. "Mrs. Coulter?" Silence. "This is Cade Mercer. I need to talk to you about an envelope that Lily Bennett found on the playground today." The silence changed. It went from groggy to sharp. The quality of air on the other end of the line shifted, the way air shifts when a door opens somewhere you can't see. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You told her to throw it away. You told her twice, and then someone broke into her house tonight, and now someone has taken her. So I'm going to ask you one time, who told you to watch for the envelope? I'm hanging up. If you hang up, the next person who knocks on your door won't be me. Another silence. Longer. He could hear her breathing, fast, shallow, panicked, and beneath the panic, something else. Guilt. The breathing of someone who'd been carrying something heavy and was about to collapse under it. I can't, she whispered. They'll kill me. They already have a child, Mrs. Coulter. Whatever they promised you, whatever they threatened you with, it doesn't matter anymore. A girl is gone. He heard a sound, choked, strangled, the sound of a woman trying to swallow a sob and failing. He said it was just monitoring. He said no one would get hurt. He said all I had to do was watch the playground and report if anyone found anything. That's all. He said it was a legal matter, an old property dispute, documents that belonged to the city. Who said this? I can't. Who? The name came out of her like a bone being extracted from living tissue. Dale Keenan. Sergeant Dale Keenan. Blackridge PD. The cop. The man in the department jacket at the processing plant. Cade's knuckles went white around the phone. How long have you been reporting to him? 3 years, since I started at the school. He approached me during orientation, said it was a routine security partnership. The school administration knew. The principal, her voice broke again. The principal signed off on it. He said Sergeant Keenan was the school resource officer liaison. What's the principal's name? Victoria Cross. Cade looked at Boone. Boone was already writing it down. Mrs. Coulter. Did Keenan ever mention anyone else? Anyone above him? No, Wait. She went quiet, then. There was one time, last year, he came to my classroom after hours. He was upset, nervous. He kept checking his phone. He said something about the foundation and how they couldn't afford another Hargrove situation. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't ask. The foundation? That's what he said. The foundation. Like it was the name of something, an organization. Cade looked at Roach. Roach was already searching. His fingers hammered the keyboard, his eyes locked on the screen, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his temples bulged. Mrs. Coulter, if Keenan contacts you, do not tell him we spoke. Do not go to school tomorrow. Do not answer your door. He hung up. Roach spoke without looking up. There's a Blackridge Community Foundation listed with the State Secretary's office. Registered nonprofit. Board of Directors includes Gerald Whitfield, Dale Keenan, Victoria Cross, and 4 other names. He turned the laptop so everyone could see. 2 of those names match initials on Hargrove's map. What does the foundation do? Boone asked. Youth development programs, after-school activities, summer camps. Roach's voice was flat, clinical, stripped of everything except the information. They receive state and federal grant funding. They operate 3 facilities in the county. Which facilities? Roach scrolled. Then he stopped scrolling. His face, already gray, went white. One of them, he said carefully, is a residential treatment center for at-risk youth on Route 7, called Mountain Line Youth Services. Mountain Line, the same name as the shell company that owned the Ridgemont plant. That's where they took her, Cade said. You don't know that? A residential facility for children, run by the same people, on the same road network, with the same shell company name. Cade grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. That's where they took her. Cade, wait. Boone stepped in front of the door, not blocking it. Boone would never physically block Cade, but standing in the space between decision and action, the way he'd stood 100 times in their shared history. If you're wrong, you're breaking into a licensed facility in the middle of the night. That's a felony. They use it to bury us. And if I'm right, there's a child in that building who has about 6 hours before she disappears the way Daniel Hargrove disappeared. Boone's jaw worked. Rain hammered the roof. The sound was relentless, mechanical, like a clock counting something down. We go together, Boone said. Gravel's hurt. Dutch stays with Gravel, you, me, and Roach. Boone walked to the workbench and opened a metal toolbox. From inside, he pulled 3 things, a pair of bolt cutters, a digital camera, and a prepaid phone still in its plastic packaging. What's the phone for? Roach asked. Insurance. Boone activated the phone and spent 45 seconds programming a number. Then he put it in his vest pocket. I spent my 24 years learning two things: how to fight and how to not get erased. If we find what Cade thinks we're going to find, we need documentation that can't be destroyed. The camera records, the phone transmits live. To a secure server I set up 3 years ago when I decided I was done trusting anyone with a badge. You set up a secure server? Dutch looked at him. I was a staff sergeant, not an idiot. They rode out at 1:30 a.m. 3 motorcycles in formation on a wet, empty road. Cade in front, Boone to his left, Roach trailing by 20 yards. The rain had settled into a steady, cold downpour that reduced visibility to 40 feet and turned the road surface into a black mirror reflecting their headlights back at them. No one spoke. The engines did the talking, 3 Harleys growling through the dark like something ancestral and furious, something older than the men who rode them. Route 7 climbed into the hills north of Blackridge, winding through dense forest where the trees grew close to the road and the shoulders dropped off into ravines. At mile marker 12, Cade saw it, a gravel drive marked by a small green sign, Mountain Line Youth Services, private property. He killed his headlight. Boone and Roach followed. They parked the bikes 200 yards from the entrance, behind a utility shed, and approached on foot. The facility was larger than Cade expected, 3 buildings arranged in a U-shape around a central parking area. The main building was 2 stories, brick and cinder block, institutional, with barred windows on the upper floor. The other 2 were single-story, prefabricated, with metal doors and no windows at all. The parking area held 6 vehicles, 2 white vans, a black SUV, a sedan, and 2 pickup trucks. For a facility that should have been asleep, there were too many cars, too much light, too much activity behind curtained windows. Cade crouched behind a drainage culvert and studied the layout through the rain. Boone was beside him, the digital camera hanging from a strap around his neck, protected from rain by the flap of his vest. Roach was to their right, pressed against the base of a pine tree, his eyes scanning the perimeter. Security? Boone whispered. 1 camera over the main entrance. Doesn't look like it covers the east side. No guards that I can see. A lot of vehicles for the middle of the night. Yeah, as Roach moved closer. The windowless buildings. In military architecture, that's a storage or holding configuration. No windows means no visual access from outside. Whatever happens in those buildings, nobody's supposed to see it. Cade made a decision. The kind of decision that lives in the body rather than the mind. Muscle memory from 1,000 entries into 1,000 buildings where the thing inside might kill you, but the thing outside was already killing someone else. Boone, camera on. Phone transmitting? Boone pressed a button on the prepaid phone. A red light blinked once. Live. Roach, stay here. If we're not back in 20 minutes, take the bikes. Don't come in after us. Go to the first journalist you can find outside the county and tell them everything. Cade, 20 minutes. Roach nodded. His face was wet. His hands were steady. He looked in that moment like the intelligence analyst he'd been before the needle took everything, sharp, focused, fully operational. Cade and Boone moved along the east side of the main building, staying low, using the vehicles for cover. The rain provided sound cover, constant, loud, masking their footsteps. They reached a side door on the east wall. Cade tried the handle. Locked. Boone handed him the bolt cutters. The padlock snapped with a sound swallowed by the rain. Inside was a corridor. Institutional green walls, fluorescent lights, half of them dead. Linoleum floor, recently mopped. The smell of bleach was fresh, sharp, aggressive. Doors on both sides, all closed, all with small windows at eye height. Cade looked through the first one. A small room, a cot, empty. The second room, same, empty. The third. Cade stopped. The room was not empty. A child sat on the cot. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, sitting upright with his hands in his lap. He was wearing institutional clothing, gray sweatpants, a white t-shirt. He was staring at the wall, not sleeping, not moving, just staring with the vacant, disconnected expression of someone who had learned to leave their body while remaining physically present. Cade's vision tunneled. The edges went dark. The center went sharp. The boy on the cot was not Emmett. Emmett had been dead for 10 years. But the size was the same, the posture was the same, the hands in the lap, the way the fingers curled slightly inward, the way the shoulders rounded forward, as if trying to make the body smaller. "Cade!" Boone's hand on his shoulder, firm, grounding. "Stay here." Cade blinked, breathed, came back. They moved down the corridor, more rooms, some empty, some not. In the rooms that were not empty, children sat or lay on cots, all in the same institutional clothing, all with the same expression, or rather, the same absence of expression. No crying, no talking, no sound at all. The silence was the loudest thing Cade had ever heard. At the end of the corridor, a door marked "Staff Only." Cade pushed it open. An office. Desk, filing cabinet, computer monitor displaying a screensaver. On the desk, a clipboard with a printed roster. Names, ages, dates of intake. No last names, no parent contacts, no caseworker assignments, just first names and numbers. Boone photographed everything. The camera clicked steadily, each shutter sound a small detonation in the silence. Cade opened the filing cabinet. Inside, hanging folders organized by date. He pulled one at random and opened it. Inside was a shipping manifest, identical in format to the spreadsheet he'd photographed at the Ridgemont plant. Dates, locations, codes. Attached to the manifest was a photograph of a child. Paperclipped to the photograph was a receipt from a wire transfer. The amount was 6 figures. Cade's hands began to shake. He pulled another folder. Same format. Different child. Different amount. Same structure. Another. 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 18 folders. 18 children. 18 transactions. Boone lowered the camera. His face was wet. Not from rain. From something else. His chest heaved once, hard, and he turned away from the filing cabinet and pressed his forehead against the wall and stood there, breathing, his massive shoulders shaking, the camera swinging from his neck like a pendulum counting the seconds, until something broke that couldn't be fixed. "Boone," Cade whispered. Boone didn't move. "We need to find Lily." Boone lifted his head. His eyes were red, destroyed, but functional. He nodded. They moved through the staff door into a connecting hallway that led to the windowless building on the west side. The hallway was darker here. No fluorescent lights, just emergency strips along the floor casting a dim green glow. The bleach smell was stronger, and beneath it, something else. Something Cade recognized from field hospitals and interrogation sites and places where people were kept in conditions that language couldn't accurately describe. A door at the end of the hallway. Cade reached for the handle. It opened from the other side. A man stood in the doorway. Mid-50s, heavy-set, wearing khaki pants and a blue polo shirt with a Mountain Line Youth Services logo embroidered on the chest. He had a coffee mug in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. His name tag read, Garrison. For 1 second, one absurd, frozen second, nobody moved. Then Garrison dropped the coffee mug. Cade caught the man by his collar before the mug hit the floor and drove him backward into the room behind him, a monitoring station with 3 screens showing camera feeds from the corridor they'd just walked through. Their figures were visible on 2 of the screens, frozen in the moment before the door opened. Boone closed the door behind them, locked it, stood with his back to it and his arms crossed. Garrison was pressed against the monitoring desk, his hands up, his eyes wide. He looked at Cade, at Boone, at the camera hanging from Boone's neck. "Who are you?" Cade didn't answer the question. "Where's Lily Bennett?" I don't know that name. 11 years old, brown hair, brought here within the last 2 hours. Where?" Garrison's mouth opened and closed. His eyes kept moving to the locked door, then to the camera, then back to Cade. Sweat was forming at his temples despite the cold. "I'm calling security." "There is no security. There's you, in a room, with 2 men who've seen everything in that filing cabinet, every folder, every manifest, every receipt." Cade leaned in close enough to see the capillaries in Garrison's eyes. 18 children. Where's number 19? Garrison's legs gave out. He slid down the desk and sat on the floor with his hands on his knees. He looked up at Cade, and in his eyes there was something Cade hadn't expected. Not defiance, not anger, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had been waiting for this moment, the way a dying man waits for the end of pain. Processing room, Garrison said. His voice was hollow. Building C, the one farthest from the road. He swallowed. She got here an hour ago. They haven't, she's still... He couldn't finish the sentence. Who brought her? Keenan. Sergeant Keenan, and another man. I don't know his name. Tall, thin, dark overcoat. The same two from the Ridgemont plant. How long has this been operating? Garrison closed his eyes. Since before I got here. I was hired 2 years ago. They told me it was a treatment facility. I found out what it really was 6 months in. He opened his eyes. They were wet. I have a family. They know where my family lives. Cade stood over him. The rage was still there, cold, permanent, structural. But something else was there too, something complicated, something that recognized the difference between a monster and a coward, and knew that the distance between them was sometimes measured in one choice that never got made. Stay in this room, Cade said. Do not touch those cameras. Do not make a phone call. If I come back and you've moved, I won't ask questions. He turned to Boone. Building C. Boone unblocked the door. They moved into the hallway. The green emergency strips lit their boots from below, turning their shadows into something monstrous on the walls. Behind them, in the monitoring room, Garrison sat on the floor with his head in his hands and did not move. Ahead of them, through 2 doors and across 40 feet of rain-soaked gravel, Building C waited, windowless, doorless on the visible side, humming with the sound of an industrial ventilation system that had no reason to exist in a building that officially stored recreational equipment. Cade pushed through the exit door into the rain. The cold hit him like a wall. He could see Building C 20 yards ahead, squat, dark, featureless. A single steel door on the north face, illuminated by a caged utility light that threw harsh white circles on the wet concrete. He was 10 steps from the door when the headlights appeared. 3 vehicles, coming up the gravel drive, moving fast. The first was a Blackridge PD cruiser. The second was a black SUV. The third was a white van identical to the 2 already parked in the lot. Cade stopped. Boone stopped beside him. The rain fell between them and the approaching lights like a curtain. Cade, Boone said. His voice was calm. Battle calm. The calm that came right before the worst part. That's Keenan. The cruiser's spotlight snapped on. It found them instantly. 2 men standing in the rain outside a windowless building at 2 in the morning, soaked, exposed, with nowhere to go. A door opened on the SUV. The tall, thin man in the dark overcoat stepped out. Behind him, 2 more men, armed. And from the cruiser, Sergeant Dale Keenan emerged in full uniform, his hand on his sidearm, his face illuminated by the spotlight's reflected glare. A face Cade now recognized from the Ridgemont parking lot, from the darkness, from the edge of everything that had gone wrong in this town for the last 8 years. Keenan looked at Cade, at Boone, at the camera around Boone's neck. You're trespassing on private property, Keenan said. Both of you, on the ground, now. Cade didn't move. The rain hammered his skull. His jacket was soaked through. The envelope was back at the compound. Lily was inside the building behind him. And between him and the girl stood a police officer, a man in an overcoat, and 2 armed men whose faces he couldn't see. He had no weapon, no badge, no authority, no legal standing of any kind. He had a camera with 18 folders worth of photographs, a prepaid phone transmitting live to a server only Boone knew about, and the absolute marrow-deep certainty that if he got on the ground, Lily Bennett would disappear the way Daniel Hargrove had disappeared, the way 18 children in 18 folders had disappeared, quietly and completely, into a system designed to swallow people whole and leave nothing behind but a sealed report and an empty room with a cot and a blank wall. Cade looked at Boone. Boone looked at Cade. And in the space between them, in the rain, in the dark, in the cold white glare of a spotlight held by a man who had spent 8 years making children vanish, a decision was made without words. The decision of 2 men who had stood back to back in places worse than this and survived, not because they were stronger, but because they had agreed long ago and without discussion that some things were worth more than survival. Cade took 1 step toward the building. Keenan drew his weapon. The rain fell between them like a wall of glass, and in the white glare of the spotlight, Keenan's service weapon was the only still thing in a world of motion. Water ran down the barrel. Keenan's hand was steady. His eyes were not. Cade took another step toward Building C. "I said get on the ground!" Keenan's voice cracked at the edges, not from weakness, but from the collision of authority and fear. The sound of a man who had controlled everything for 8 years suddenly realizing he was standing in front of someone who could not be controlled. "Shoot me," Cade said. He didn't stop walking. His boots hit the wet gravel with a steady, deliberate rhythm. Each step was a sentence. Each step said, "I know what's in that building. I know what's in those folders. I know what you've done. And I am walking toward that door." "Shoot me," he said again, in front of a camera, transmitting live, to a server you'll never find. Keenan's eyes flicked to the camera around Boone's neck. The red recording light was visible even through the rain, a small, unblinking eye that saw everything and forgot nothing. Keenan's jaw tightened. The gun stayed up, but his index finger moved, just slightly, just a fraction, from the trigger to the guard. The movement of a man recalculating. The tall man in the overcoat stepped forward. He was calm in a way that Keenan was not, the calm of someone who managed crises rather than created them. His voice was low, measured, almost pleasant. "Mr. Mercer, that's your name, isn't it?" Cade Mercer, former military, currently operating an unlicensed repair shop on Route 12. No family, no connections, no one who'd miss you. He paused. "Let's not make this dramatic." Cade stopped 5 feet from the Building C door. He turned to face the man. The rain hammered both of them equally, democratically, without preference. "What's your name?" "That's not relevant." "It's relevant to me, and to the server." The man's lips thinned. He glanced at the camera, a fast glance, involuntary, the first crack in the polish. "My name is Alden Shaw. I'm the director of Mountain Line Youth Services. You're trespassing on a licensed residential facility in the middle of the night. Whatever you think you've seen, 18 folders," Cade said. 18 children. First names only. No caseworkers, no parent contacts. Wire transfer receipts and 6 figures attached to photographs of minors. He let each word land separately, like rounds hitting a target at center mass. "That's what I've seen." Shaw's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. A tectonic movement, deep and structural, the kind of shift that precedes collapse. "You broke into a private office and your employee Garrison is sitting in the monitoring room right now, ready to tell anyone who asks exactly how long this has been happening and exactly who's involved." Cade didn't know if this was true. Garrison might have bolted the moment they left, but the statement wasn't for Garrison. It was for Shaw, and Shaw's face told him it landed. "Sergeant," Shaw's voice went flat. "Arrest these men, trespassing, breaking and entering, whatever you need." Keenan moved forward. 2 steps. 3. His weapon was still drawn. Boone hadn't moved from his position 10 feet behind Cade, a massive silhouette in the rain, the camera held chest high, recording everything. Boone's silence was louder than Keenan's gun. It was the silence of a man who had decided something and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. "On the ground," Keenan said to Boone. "Both of you. Now." Boone spoke for the first time. His voice was deep, unhurried, and carried the weight of a man who had once stood before a military tribunal and told 3 generals exactly what he thought of their airstrike order. "My name is Boone Carter, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired, service number 847263190. I am currently transmitting live audio and video to a secure server located outside this jurisdiction. The feed includes your face, your badge number, your name, this facility, and the contents of 18 files documenting the trafficking of minors through a nonprofit organization funded by state and federal grants." He paused. The rain filled the silence. "You can arrest me, but the feed doesn't stop, and the people who receive it don't answer to you." Keenan's gun hand dropped 3 inches. Not a surrender, a recalibration. The math was changing in his head. Cade could see it happening in real time. The way you could see a man's resolve crumble when the cost of action exceeded the cost of retreat. But Shaw was not recalculating. Shaw was hardening. His eyes moved from Boone to the 2 armed men standing behind the SUV, and he gave a nod so small it was almost invisible, a twitch of the chin, a micro-movement that carried enormous weight. The two men moved, fast. One flanked left toward Boone. The other came straight at Cade. Cade had been expecting it. Not because he was smart, because he'd spent 22 years in environments where the moment before violence had a specific texture, a specific smell, a specific frequency that his nervous system had learned to detect the way some animals detect earthquakes before the ground moves. The man coming at him was big, 6'3", 220, built like someone who'd played football in college, and then found a career that let him keep hitting people. He moved fast but linear, straight line, the way men moved when they'd learned violence in gyms rather than in war. Cade sidestepped at the last second. The man's momentum carried him past, and Cade caught his arm, redirected the motion, and drove him face first into the steel door of Building C. The impact was wet and heavy, the sound of bone meeting metal through a layer of rain-soaked skin. The man went down. Stayed down. His nose was broken and his hands went to his face instinctively, and by the time his brain told his body to get back up, Cade had already turned to face whatever was behind him. Behind him, Boone had the second man on the ground. It had taken less than 4 seconds. Boone's method was different. No redirection, no technique, just raw, practiced brutality, applied with surgical precision. He'd caught the man's lead hand, twisted the wrist until something popped, and put him on the gravel with a knee in his spine. The man was screaming into the mud. Boone's face showed nothing. His hands showed everything. Steady, experienced, the hands of a man who had done this before and would do it again without losing a minute of sleep. Keenan's gun came back up. "Don't," Cade said. Keenan hesitated. The gun was aimed at Cade's chest, 12 feet of distance, rain between them. The spotlight from the cruiser turned everything into a theater of white light and black shadow. Keenan's face was a mask of competing impulses, training, fear, loyalty to the network that had paid him for 8 years. And something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, as if some buried part of him understood that the thing he was protecting was indefensible and always had been. "Dale," Shaw's voice came from behind the SUV. He'd retreated to cover the moment the violence started. "Do your job." Keenan's finger touched the trigger, and then a sound cut through the rain, distant but growing, a low rumble that Cade felt before he heard it. Not thunder, not a truck. Something else. Something that vibrated at a frequency every biker recognized the way a wolf recognizes a howl from across a valley. Motorcycles. Multiple engines. Coming up Route 7. Coming fast. Keenan heard it too. His eyes left Cade and went to the gravel drive where headlights were appearing through the tree line. Not one set, not two, but 5, 6, 7 sets of headlights cutting through the rain in formation, the engines growing from a rumble to a roar to a sound that filled the entire valley like the breath of something enormous and ancient and very, very angry. Roach. Cade understood it instantly. Roach hadn't waited 20 minutes. Roach had seen the cruiser and the SUV arrive, had understood that 2 men against armed opposition was a losing equation, and had done the thing his intelligence training had taught him. He'd changed the variables. He'd made calls. To who, Cade didn't know. The Iron Veil had 4 members, but the biker world was a network of networks. Veterans who knew veterans, men scattered across West Virginia and Maryland who owed favors or shared debts, or simply answered when someone called at 2 in the morning and said a child was in danger. The motorcycles came through the gate like a cavalry charge. 7 bikes. 7 riders. They spread across the parking area in a V formation, engines idling, headlights turning the rain into a wall of silver. The riders didn't dismount immediately. They sat on their machines, leather-clad, rain-soaked, faces half hidden by helmets or hoods, and they waited. The collective sound of their engines was a statement that required no translation. Roach was in the center. He'd called the only people he knew who would come without asking why. Members of other veteran motorcycle groups from neighboring counties. Men and women who didn't know Cade, didn't know Lily, didn't know anything about the envelope or the foundation or the 18 folders. They knew one thing. A brother had called. A child was in danger. The road was wet and the night was cold, and none of that mattered. One by one, they killed their engines. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. 7 riders dismounted. Some were tall, some were short. One was a woman, Mid-40s, gray-streaked hair, a leather vest with a faded Army Ranger's patch. They stood in the rain with their hands at their sides, and they looked at Keenan, and they looked at Shaw, and they looked at the two men on the ground, and they said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Keenan holstered his weapon. It wasn't a decision. It was a collapse, the structural failure of a position that had relied on isolation, on the assumption that nobody would come, that the night and the rain and the remoteness of Route 7 would keep this contained. 7 motorcycles had shattered that assumption the way Cade's fist had shattered the first man's nose. Shaw stepped out from behind the SUV. His composure was fracturing now, visible in the way his hands moved, small, repetitive gestures, adjusting his coat, touching his collar, the fidgeting of a man whose control architecture was disintegrating in real time. "This changes nothing," Shaw said. His voice was still controlled, but the edges were fraying. "You have no authority, no warrant, no jurisdiction. Whatever you think you're doing—" "We're documenting," Boone said. He stepped forward, camera raised, and the red recording light found Shaw's face like a laser sight. Every word, every face, every building, every child in every room in that corridor. And in approximately, he checked his phone, 40 minutes, a copy of everything on this camera and everything on that server will be in the hands of the FBI field office in Pittsburgh, the United States Attorney for the Northern District of West Virginia, the Associated Press, and 2 independent journalists who've been investigating institutional trafficking for the last 4 years. He lowered the camera slightly. "You're right that we have no authority. We don't need authority. We need witnesses." Shaw's mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time, his face showed what was underneath the composure. Not cruelty, not malice, but the specific terror of a man watching the mechanism he'd spent years building come apart in front of him, bolt by bolt, in the rain. Cade turned his back on all of them, turned away from Keenan and Shaw and the armed men on the ground and the 7 riders standing in the rain. He walked to the steel door of Building C, gripped the handle, and pulled. Locked. He turned to Keenan. "Keys." Keenan didn't move. "Keys." The word was not a request. It was the sound a man makes when he has passed through fear and anger and arrived at a place beyond both. A place where the voice goes flat and the eyes go still and the body becomes a delivery system for a single, irreducible intention. Keenan reached into his pocket. His hands were shaking. He pulled out a ring of keys and threw them on the ground between them. They landed in a puddle with a splash that was louder than it should have been. Cade picked them up. 3rd key. The lock turned. The door opened onto darkness and the smell of industrial disinfectant and something beneath it. Sweat, urine, fear, the biological residue of children kept in spaces not designed for keeping. The ventilation system hummed overhead, cycling air that had nowhere to go. Cade pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight. A corridor. Shorter than the one in the main building. 4 doors on the left, 2 on the right, all closed. The walls were unpainted cinder block. The floor was bare concrete, stained in patterns that Cade's mind refused to interpret. He opened the first door on the left. A small room, no window. A cot, a bucket, a folded blanket. A child, a girl, maybe 7, sitting on the floor in the corner with her knees drawn up to her chest and her face hidden behind her arms. She didn't look up when the light hit her. She didn't flinch. She was beyond flinching. She'd reached the place where the body stops responding to external stimuli because every response has been proven useless. Cade crouched in the doorway. His throat closed, his vision blurred. The phone in his hand trembled, and for a moment, just a moment, the girl in the corner was not a stranger. She was every child he'd failed. She was Emmett, face down in a creek behind a blue house. She was the shoe in the photograph. She was the sentence at the bottom of a dead man's letter. Boone appeared behind him, photographed the room, the girl, the bucket, the bare walls. The camera clicked with mechanical indifference, recording horrors that no machine could understand and no person should have to. They moved down the corridor, 2nd door. Another child, a boy, slightly older, lying on the cot with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He didn't acknowledge their presence. He was somewhere else. Wherever that somewhere was, it was better than here. 3rd door, Lily. She was sitting on the edge of the cot with her hands in her lap, exactly the way the first boy in the main building had been sitting, upright, still, dissociated. But when Cade's flashlight hit her face, something happened that the other children hadn't done. She looked up. She saw him. And something in her eyes reignited, not hope exactly, but recognition. The recognition that the world contained at least one person who had come back for her. "Cade," she said. Her voice was small and broken and enormous. He crossed the room in 2 steps and knelt in front of her. His hands, those scarred, swollen, crooked-fingered hands, took her small hands and held them, and they were ice cold, and she was shaking, and her coat was gone, and she was wearing a white t-shirt that wasn't hers, and the rage that Cade had kept architectural, structural, load-bearing, the rage he'd used as a foundation, it cracked. "I'm here," he said. His voice broke on the second word, and he didn't care. "I'm here. You're done. It's done." Lily's face crumpled, not slowly, all at once, like a building whose supports have been removed simultaneously. She fell forward into his chest, and her arms went around his neck, and she held on with the desperate, total, absolute grip of a child who has been dropped into the dark and then pulled back out by the one person who said they would come. Cade stood. Lily didn't let go. He carried her, one arm under her legs, one across her back, the way he had never been able to carry Emmett out of the water, the way he had imagined carrying him every night for 10 years in dreams that ended with empty arms and the sound of a creek and a phone ringing in a desert on the other side of the world. Boone was already opening the other doors. The children didn't move at first. They sat in their rooms, in their corners, on their cots, waiting, because waiting was all they knew. But slowly, one by one, as Boone crouched and spoke to each of them in that deep, steady voice, they stood. They came to the doorway. They stepped into the corridor. They followed the big man with the camera and the wet eyes toward the open door where the rain was falling, and the cold air smelled like pine trees and gasoline and freedom. 7 children in Building C. Combined with the ones in the main building corridor, the count was 13. 13 children in a facility that processed them like freight, that assigned them numbers instead of names, that sold them across state lines through shell companies and coded manifests. Cade carried Lily out into the rain. The 7 riders were still standing in the parking area, and when they saw him, a soaked, scarred, trembling man carrying a small girl through a steel door, followed by children in institutional clothing emerging one by one into a night that had become something else. Something transformed. Several of them turned away. Not from disgust, from the specific kind of anguish that hits you when you see something you can never unsee, and you know that the person you were 5 seconds ago no longer exists. The woman with the ranger's patch moved first. She walked to the children emerging from Building C and knelt in the mud in front of a boy who couldn't have been more than 6, and she held out her hands, and the boy took them. And she didn't speak, and neither did he, and the rain fell on both of them equally. One by one, the riders took off their jackets and wrapped them around the children's shoulders. Leather jackets stained with road grime and engine oil and years of wind draped over small bodies in white t-shirts. The contrast was violent and tender and impossible. The armor of broken men used to warm the bodies of broken children, and in that exchange something happened that none of them would ever be able to articulate, but all of them would remember for the rest of their lives. Keenan was sitting in his cruiser. He hadn't moved. He hadn't driven away. He sat behind the wheel with his hands at 10 and 2, staring through the windshield at the rain and the motorcycles and the children and the leather jackets, and something was happening to his face, a slow molecular collapse, as if the mask he'd worn for 8 years was dissolving in the rain, and what was underneath was not a monster, but a man who had made a choice he could never take back and was only now understanding what it had cost. Shaw was gone. At some point during the confusion, he'd gotten into the SUV and disappeared down the gravel drive. Cade noticed his absence but didn't react. Shaw could run. Shaw could drive to the state line, to an airport, to the edge of the continent. It didn't matter. The camera had his face. The server had his voice. The files had his name. Boone was on the prepaid phone now, pacing the parking area, speaking fast and low. Cade caught fragments. 13 children. Route 7. Mile marker 12. Mountain Line Youth Services, FBI Pittsburgh. Yes, I'm sure. I'm transmitting now. Yes. Everything. The whole building. Roach stood apart from the group. He was leaning against his motorcycle, smoking a cigarette that the rain kept trying to extinguish. His hands were steady for the first time in years. Not the steadiness of sobriety, but the steadiness of purpose. He'd called 7 riders in the middle of the night, and they'd come. He'd changed the equation. The intelligence analyst who'd drowned his gift in heroin had for one night been exactly what he was designed to be, the man who saw the board clearly enough to know which piece to move. Cade stood in the rain with Lily in his arms. She'd stopped shaking. Her face was pressed into the curve of his neck, and her breathing had slowed. Not the quick, shallow breathing of terror, but the deep, rhythmic breathing of exhaustion finding safety. She was heavy. Not physically, she weighed almost nothing, but heavy in the way that trust is heavy, in the way that a child's unconscious decision to fall asleep in a stranger's arms is the heaviest thing a human being can carry. His phone buzzed. He shifted Lily's weight to his left arm and checked the screen with his right hand. Boone. Text message. FBI field office confirms. Agents en route. ETA 90 minutes. State police alerted independently. Do not let anyone leave. Cade looked at Keenan's cruiser. The engine was off. The lights were off. Keenan was still sitting behind the wheel, motionless. Then another buzz. Different sender. The blocked number. Cade's stomach turned to ice. A photograph. Not of Lily this time. Of the Iron Vale compound, taken from the access road. Through the rain, the floodlight visible. The gate visible. And standing just inside the gate, barely illuminated, the silhouette of a large man in a folding chair. Gravel. And Dutch. Beneath the photograph, 3 words. We have options. Cade's blood stopped moving. The rain continued to fall, but he couldn't feel it anymore. He couldn't feel anything except the weight of the girl in his arms and the cold screen of the phone in his hand and the understanding, sudden, total, devastating, that the network was not one building. It was not one cop and one director and 2 armed men. It was a system. A living system with nodes and contingencies and the ability to strike at multiple points simultaneously. And while Cade and Boone and Roach and 7 riders had been here, at Mountain Line, pulling children out of concrete rooms, someone else had been at the compound, where Gravel was concussed and Dutch had a prosthetic leg, and neither of them knew what was coming. Boone! Boone turned, phone still at his ear. Cade showed him the screen. Boone's face went through 3 expressions in under a second. Confusion, recognition, and something beyond anger, something that existed in the space where emotion becomes action without the intermediate step of thought. He spoke into the phone. I need to call you back. Hung up. Looked at the 7 riders. Looked at the children. Looked at the road. Roach! Boone called. You stay. You and the others. Guard the children. Nobody moves. Nobody leaves. FBI is 90 minutes out. Roach dropped his cigarette. Where are you going? The compound. Dutch and Gravel. You don't know what's there. I know what's here. Boone gestured at the children, at the rooms, at the building. And if they can do this... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Cade looked down at Lily. She was asleep. Deeply asleep. The kind of sleep that only comes after the body has exhausted every chemical it has and simply stops. He carried her to the woman with the ranger's patch, the woman who was still kneeling in the mud with the small boy's hands in hers, and gently, slowly, carefully transferred Lily's weight from his arms to hers. Her name is Lily, Cade said. She doesn't let go easily. Don't make her. The woman looked up at him. Her eyes were hard and wet and ancient, the eyes of a soldier who had seen the inside of Bagram and Mosul and 100 places that existed only in classified briefings and nightmares. She took Lily's weight without effort and without question. Go, she said. Cade went. 2 motorcycles, 1 road, rain like ammunition. Cade and Boone rode side by side at speeds that turned the center line into a single continuous thread and the trees into a tunnel of black. Neither man spoke. Neither man could have spoken. The engines consumed everything, sound, thought, the space between fear and action. The road was a river of reflected light, and their tires cut through it, and behind them the water closed as if they'd never been there. The compound appeared around the final bend, and Cade knew immediately that something was wrong. The floodlight was out, not burned out, shot out. The glass housing was shattered, fragments glittering on the wet gravel. The gate was open. Not unlocked, forced. The chain link was bent inward, pushed by a vehicle. Inside the compound, the workshop bay door was open. Light spilled out, not electric light, but something warmer, more volatile. Firelight. Cade was off the bike before it stopped. He ran through the gate, boots sliding on wet gravel, and the smell hit him. Accelerant. Gasoline. The workshop bay was burning. Flames licked up the corrugated walls from the inside, fed by fuel that had been splashed across the workbenches and tool racks. The heat was intense, pushing him back. But through the open bay door, he could see that the fire was contained to the workshop. The clubhouse next to it was still dark, still intact. "Dutch!" Cade shouted. "Gravel!" No answer. Just the sound of fire consuming metal and wood, and the accumulated labor of 3 years of building something that mattered. Boone went left, toward the clubhouse. Cade went right, circling the burning workshop. Behind the building, in the narrow space between the corrugated wall and the fence, he found them. Dutch was on the ground, his prosthetic leg detached and lying 3 feet away. His face was bloodied, a cut above his left eye, swelling around his jaw. He was conscious but disoriented, propping himself up on one elbow, reaching for the prosthetic with his other hand. His eyes found Cade, and there was fury in them. Not fear, not pain, but the specific, incandescent fury of a man who has been caught vulnerable by an enemy who exploited that vulnerability. "2 of them," Dutch spat. Blood ran down his chin. "Came through the gate in a truck. Hit the workshop with gasoline. I came out and they—" He gestured at his missing leg. "Pulled it off me. Like a joke. Like it was a joke." Cade knelt beside him, grabbed the prosthetic, handed it back. Dutch reattached it with practiced, angry hands. Click, click, click. The mechanical sound of a man rebuilding himself from the ground up, the way he'd done at Walter Reed, the way he'd done every morning since Helmand. "Gravel?" Dutch's face changed. The fury dimmed. Something else replaced it. Something worse. Inside. They went inside first. Gravel tried to stop them. Cade ran. The clubhouse door was ajar. He pushed through it into the main room, and the first thing he saw was the overturned table, the scarred, burned, knife-marked table where they'd sat together and argued and decided to go to war. It was on its side, one leg broken. The folding chairs were scattered. The wood stove had been knocked off its base, ash and embers spilling across the concrete floor. Gravel was sitting against the far wall. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. There was blood on his hands, not his. His knuckles were split open and swollen. His face was calm, absolutely calm. The calm of a combat medic who has assessed his own injuries and determined them non-critical. At his feet, zip-tied at the wrists with electrical cable, was a man Cade didn't recognize. The man was unconscious, breathing through a mouth that was missing 2 front teeth. His nose was flattened. His right eye was already swelling shut. "He was the slower one," Gravel said. His voice was quiet, even, almost conversational. "The other one ran when the fire started." Cade looked at the unconscious man, then at Gravel, then at Gravel's hands, those thick, precise hands that had been trained to save lives and had spent this night doing something adjacent. "You okay?" Gravel held up his right hand. The brass ring on the leather cord around his neck was visible through his torn shirt. "Couple cracked knuckles. I'll set them myself." Of course he would. Boone came through the door. He looked at the overturned table, the scattered chairs, the unconscious man on the floor. Then he looked at Gravel, and a sound came out of him. Not a laugh, not a cry, something between both, something that only happens when relief and fury arrive simultaneously and the body doesn't know which to express. "Workshop's gone," Boone said. "Fire's spreading to the roof. Nothing we can save." Cade walked to the window. The workshop was fully engulfed now, orange and yellow flames visible through every gap in the corrugated steel, smoke rising into the rain and being beaten back down. 3 years of tools, parts, projects, equipment, the physical manifestation of 4 men trying to build something quiet and functional and good in a world that rewarded none of those qualities, burning in the West Virginia night. He watched it burn. And as he watched, something in him burned too. Not the rage, which was still there, structural, permanent, but something else. The last remnant of the man who had come to Black Ridge to disappear. The man who fixed motorcycles in a rented bay and drank bad coffee and kept a photograph taped inside his toolbox and spoke to no one about anything that mattered. That man was fuel now. That man was ash. What remained was something leaner, harder, closer to bone. A man who carried a sleeping girl out of a concrete room. A man whose brothers had bled for him tonight. A man who had 18 folders of evidence on a server, 13 children in the custody of 7 riders, a concussed medic with split knuckles and an unconscious prisoner at his feet, and approximately 70 minutes before the FBI arrived. His phone buzzed. Roach. Children are secure. All 13 accounted for. 2 need medical attention. Dehydration and what looks like a stress fracture on a boy's wrist. The woman from the Rangers group is handling triage. No movement on the access road. Shaw hasn't come back. A pause. Cade. There's something else. What? Garrison talked. The employee from the monitoring room. He didn't run. He stayed. And he talked. He told us everything. Roach's voice was different now. Not shaking, not manic, but heavy, as if the information he was carrying had physical weight. The Foundation has a 4th facility, not in the county, in Maryland, Eastern Shore, a property registered under a different shell. He says that's where Shaw is going. That's the hub. That's where the records are, the real records. Not paper files, digital, encrypted, years of transactions, hundreds of names. Cade closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw the road, wet, black, endless. He saw the rain. He saw Lily's face crumpled against his chest. He saw a creek behind a blue house and a boy in a baseball cap and a phone ringing on the other side of the world. Send the location to Boone's server, Cade said. FBI gets everything. The 4th facility, the shell company, Shaw's name, Garrison's testimony, all of it. Done. Roach. Yeah. You changed the math tonight, those 7 riders. That was you. Silence on the line, then very quietly. I had to be worth something, Cade. At least once. You always were. He hung up. Outside, the fire roared. The rain fell. Somewhere on Route 7, 13 children sat wrapped in leather jackets that smelled like engine oil and road dust, surrounded by strangers who would not leave them, guarded by a man who had spent 3 years believing his intelligence was a curse and had tonight used it to save lives. And somewhere on a highway heading east, Alden Shaw was driving toward Maryland with the belief that distance could save him, that the system he'd built was large enough to absorb this, that money and structure and shell companies could outrun 2 men on motorcycles and a camera with a red light. He was wrong. Boone's server was already transmitting. The FBI was already moving. The data was already free, replicating, spreading, moving through digital channels like water finding cracks in a dam. Unstoppable, irreversible, the truth doing what truth does when it escapes the room where it's been locked for 8 years. Cade walked to his motorcycle. The Softail sat in the rain, black and patient, the engine ticking as it cooled. He put his hand on the fuel tank and stood there, looking at the burning workshop, at the open gate, at the mud and the broken fence, and the sky full of rain and smoke. Boone appeared beside him. They stood together in the orange light of the fire, shoulders almost touching, 2 men at the end of the longest night of their lives. It's not over, Boone said. No, Cade agreed, but it's different now. How's it different? Cade looked at him. In the firelight, Boone's face was a landscape of shadows and lines and scars and something else. Something that looked impossibly like peace. Not the absence of pain, not the end of struggle. Just the specific peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you should be, doing exactly what you were made to do, standing next to exactly the right person. Before tonight, Cade said, they were invisible. Now the whole world can see them. Boone nodded. The fire crackled. The rain fell. Sirens, distant, growing, began to echo through the valley. And the sound was not rescue exactly, not cavalry, but confirmation. Confirmation that the signal had been received, that the evidence was moving through systems they couldn't corrupt, that the names and faces and numbers were already in hands that would not let go. Cade mounted the Softail. The engine came alive beneath him, deep, percussive, faithful. The sound of a machine that had carried him through 3 years of silence and one night of war and was ready, still, for whatever came next. Boone mounted beside him on his Road King. The two engines idled together, their rhythms slightly offset, creating a sound that was not unison but harmony. Two frequencies that had learned over 19 years and 100 broken promises in one burning workshop and 13 children wrapped in leather jackets, how to exist together. The sirens were louder now. Blue and red lights appeared on Route 7, distant, flickering through the rain in the trees, growing brighter. Cade looked east, toward the compound, toward the fire, toward the morning that was still hours away but was coming, inevitable, the way mornings always came after the longest nights. And beneath his jacket, against his ribs, against the scar he never talked about, the space where the envelope had once rested was empty now, but the weight of it remained permanent, the phantom pressure of a dead man's letter and a child's trust, and a truth that had waited 8 years in the dirt for someone brave enough to open it. The FBI arrived at 3:47 a.m. 4 black SUVs and 2 unmarked sedans came up Route 7 in a convoy that moved with the disciplined precision of an operation that had been activated from sleep and assembled in under an hour. They came without sirens, just headlights cutting through rain that had finally begun to thin, the downpour softening into a mist that hung in the valley like a held breath. Cade and Boone were back at the Mountain Line facility when the convoy pulled through the gate. They'd ridden from the burning compound to Route 7 in 11 minutes, and when they arrived, the scene they'd left was exactly as they'd left it. 13 children wrapped in leather jackets, 7 riders standing guard in a loose perimeter, Roach smoking his 4th cigarette near the entrance to Building C, and the woman with the ranger's patch sitting cross-legged in the mud with Lily asleep in her lap. The girl's face pressed into the worn leather of a vest that smelled like highway wind and decades of survival. The lead agent was a woman named Torres, mid-40s, sharp-jawed, wearing a navy windbreaker with FBI in yellow letters across the back. She stepped out of the first SUV and surveyed the scene with the rapid, cataloging gaze of someone trained to absorb entire environments in seconds. Her eyes moved across the children, the riders, the open door of Building C, the 2 injured men zip-tied near the cruiser where Keenan still sat motionless behind the wheel, and finally landed on Cade and Boone standing side by side near the entrance. She walked to them, stopped 3 feet away, looked at Boone's camera, at the prepaid phone in his vest pocket, at the blood on Cade's knuckles. "Which one of you is the one who's been transmitting to the Pittsburgh field office?" Boone stepped forward. "That's me." "Boone Carter, Staff Sergeant, retired." "Yes, ma'am." Torres studied him for a long moment. Then she looked at the building behind them, and something moved across her face. Not surprise, not shock, but the specific expression of a law enforcement professional who has seen the evidence before arriving at the scene and is now confirming that the reality matches the data, and that both are worse than she'd allowed herself to imagine. "We've been looking at the Black Ridge Community Foundation for 18 months, Torres said. "Anonymous tip to our field office last year, but every lead went cold. Witnesses recanted, records disappeared. The county DA blocked 3 subpoena requests." She paused. 18 months. And you did this in one night. "We had motivation," Cade said. Torres looked at the children, at Lily, asleep in the ranger woman's lap, at the boy with the stress fracture on his wrist, now being examined by a female agent with a medical kit, at the smallest child, a girl, maybe 6, standing in the mist in an oversized leather jacket that reached her knees, holding the hand of a bearded biker twice her height, neither of them speaking, neither of them letting go. "I need your camera," Torres said to Boone, "and your phone, and everything on that server." Boone didn't hesitate. He lifted the camera strap over his head and handed it over. Then the phone. Server credentials are saved in the phone's notes. Everything auto-uploaded. Photographs, audio, GPS data. Garrison's initial statement is recorded. Garrison? Employee? Monitoring room. Main building. He cooperated voluntarily. Torres dispatched 2 agents to the main building and 2 more to Building C. She turned back to Cade. "I need a full statement from you. Tonight. You'll get it. But first," Cade nodded toward Keenan's cruiser. "Sergeant Dale Keenan, Black Ridge PD." He's been embedded in the network for at least 8 years. He was the liaison to a teacher at Blackridge Elementary, a woman named Coulter, who monitored the playground site where evidence was originally buried by a municipal clerk named Daniel Hargrove. Torres's eyes sharpened. Hargrove. That name came up in our preliminary investigation. Missing persons case sealed by the county prosecutor. Gerald Whitfield, now the county DA. He's on the foundation's board. So is the school principal, Victoria Cross. And the director of this facility, Alden Shaw, fled approximately 2 hours ago, heading east, toward a fourth facility on Maryland's eastern shore. Cade gave her the address Roach had relayed. That's where the digital records are, encrypted, years of transactions. If Shaw reaches it before you do, he'll destroy everything. Torres was already on her radio. Instructions flowed out of her in sharp, clipped phrases. Intercept requests, coordination with Maryland State Police, asset seizure protocols, the mechanical language of federal law enforcement engaging at operational speed. Within 3 minutes, she had 2 agencies mobilized across 2 states and a digital forensics team en route from Quantico. Cade stood in the mist and watched the machinery of justice. The real kind. The kind that moved through proper channels with proper authority and proper documentation, begin to turn. It was slow. It was procedural. It was everything that Daniel Hargrove had tried to activate 8 years ago and failed. But it was turning now. The difference was not the machinery. The machinery had always been there. The difference was that someone had finally put evidence in front of it that couldn't be sealed, redirected, or buried. Evidence carried out of a playground by an 11-year-old girl in an oversized coat. They gave their statements in the back of an FBI vehicle. Cade first, then Boone, then Roach. Each statement took over an hour. Cade told the story from the beginning. The bench outside Harlan's diner, the girl crossing the street, the envelope, the letter, the processing plant, the playing cards, the compound, the night ride to Route 7. He told it in a flat, steady voice, the way he'd given debriefs after missions that hadn't gone according to plan, which was every mission he'd ever been on. The agent recording him typed without expression. The recorder's red light blinked steadily. The mist collected on the vehicle's windows like condensation on a glass. By the time the statements were complete, the sky had begun to change. Not dawn, not yet, but the first suggestion of dawn, a thinning of the darkness at the eastern horizon, a shift from black to the deep blue-gray that came before first light. The rain had stopped entirely. The air smelled like wet pine and smoke from the distant compound fire, which had burned itself out sometime during the hours of testimony, leaving behind a skeleton of scorched steel and ash. Keenan was taken into federal custody at 5:12 a.m. He exited his cruiser voluntarily when Torres approached with 2 agents and a pair of handcuffs. He didn't speak. He didn't resist. He placed his hands behind his back with the mechanical compliance of a man who had been waiting for this moment for years and was, in some perverse way, relieved that it had finally arrived. As the agents led him to the SUV, he passed within 4 feet of Cade. Their eyes met. Keenan's were empty, not cold, not hostile, just empty. The way a house is empty after everyone has moved out and the only thing left is the echo of what used to live there. Cade said nothing. There was nothing to say to a man who had chosen to protect a machine that consumed children. No words existed for that particular species of failure. Silence was the only appropriate language. Gerald Whitfield was arrested at his home at 5:45 a.m. Cade learned this from Torres, who relayed it without emotion, as a data point. Victoria Cross was taken into custody at the school at 6:30 a.m. before students arrived. Alden Shaw was intercepted on Y-68 near Cumberland, Maryland at 6:17 a.m., driving 93 miles per hour in a rented sedan with a laptop and 2 external hard drives on the passenger seat. The hard drives contained encrypted files that the FBI's digital forensics team would spend the next several weeks decoding, files that would eventually reveal the full scope of the Foundation's operations across 4 states and 7 years, involving 31 children, 14 shell companies, and financial transactions totaling over $12 million. But all of that was later. All of that was the slow, grinding machinery of justice doing what it did after the human part was over. The arrests, the indictments, the court dates, the media coverage, the congressional inquiries, all of it would unfold over months and years, layer by layer, the the way sediment accumulates over buried things until the landscape is permanently changed. What happened in the hours after dawn was smaller, quieter, and infinitely more important. The children were transported to a regional hospital 40 miles from Black Ridge. Ambulances had arrived just before 6, along with social workers from a neighboring county who had no connection to the foundation or its network. The children were examined, documented, and placed in temporary protective custody. 3 had family members who could be located. The others did not. The process was slow and painful and imperfect, the way all institutional processes are when they involve human beings who have been treated as cargo. But it was happening, and it was real, and for the first time in years, the system was working in their direction rather than against them. Lily was the last child to leave the facility. She had woken sometime around 5, still in the ranger woman's lap, and had refused to move until Cade crouched in front of her and told her it was over. She looked at him with those huge brown eyes, the same eyes that had studied him from 8 feet away outside Harlan's diner, the same eyes that had asked a question she already knew the answer to, and she said, "For real? For real? They're going to jail?" "Yes." "All of them?" "Every single one." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What about the other kids, the ones in the rooms?" "They're safe. They're going to a hospital. People are going to help them." "Real people? Not like the ones who were supposed to help before?" The question cut Cade deeper than he expected. Because she was right. Every adult in her life who was supposed to protect children, her teacher, her principal, the police, had been part of the system that harmed them. The fundamental contract between children and adults had been violated so completely that an 11-year-old girl no longer believed in the concept of protection itself. "Real people," Cade said. "I promise." Lily looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out and touched the scar on the bridge of his nose, just her fingertip, light as a moth landing, and said, "You kept your promise." He had. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he had made a promise and kept it. Not a large promise, not a heroic promise, just the promise implicit in the act of not throwing away an envelope, the promise that said, "I see what you found, and I will not look away." Lily's mother arrived at the hospital at 8:30 a.m. Her name was Karen Bennett, and she was a small, tired woman with the same brown hair as her daughter and the same dark circles under her eyes. And when she came through the emergency room doors and saw Lily sitting on a plastic chair in a borrowed jacket 3 sizes too large, she made a sound that Cade had only heard once before in his life, the sound his wife had made on the satellite phone, the sound of a parent's world collapsing and reconstructing in the same instant. Karen ran to Lily. Lily ran to Karen. They collided in the middle of the waiting room with a force that was entirely emotional and entirely physical simultaneously, and Karen dropped to her knees and pulled her daughter against her chest and held her with both arms and her entire body and a strength that seemed impossible for a woman her size, and she rocked her back and forth, and she said her name, just her name, over and over. "Lily, Lily, Lily," as if the repetition could rebuild the hours between them, could fill the gap where terror had been with something solid and warm and permanent. Cade watched from the doorway. He didn't enter the room. This moment was not his. It belonged to a mother and a daughter, and the space between them that no biker, no soldier, no damaged man with scarred hands could occupy. He stood in the doorway with his arms at his sides, and his leather jacket still damp from rain that had stopped hours ago, and he watched, and he let himself feel it, the full, unfiltered weight of what it looked like when a broken thing began to mend. Boone found him there. "Hey." Cade didn't turn. "Hey." "Roach sent the last of the data to Torres. The server's been mirrored to 3 separate federal databases. Even if someone tried to destroy it now, it's everywhere. It can't be erased." "Good." Boone leaned against the door frame beside him. The 2 men stood shoulder to shoulder, watching through the glass as Karen Bennett held her daughter on the waiting room floor, and a nurse knelt beside them with a blanket and a cup of water, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the indifferent constancy of machines that didn't know what had happened and wouldn't have cared if they did. "Dutch called," Boone said. "Insurance adjuster is coming for the workshop. Fire department ruled it arson. He says the bay is gone, but the clubhouse is salvageable. Foundation's cracked, but the walls are standing." Cade almost smiled. "Sounds about right." Gravel set his own knuckles, used a splint made from a motorcycle spoke and electrical tape. Of course he did. Silence. Comfortable. The silence of two men who had said everything that needed saying in a burning compound at 2 a.m. and had nothing left to prove to each other. "What are you going to do?" Boone asked. Cade considered the question. It was the same question he'd been asking himself for 3 years. What to do, where to go, how to fill the hours between waking and sleeping in a way that didn't feel like waiting for something that would never arrive. But the question felt different now. It had a different weight, a different shape. "Rebuild the workshop," Cade said. Boone looked at him. "You said the foundation's cracked, but the walls are standing. So we fix the foundation, pour new concrete, replace the bay doors, get the tools back." He paused. "It's what we know how to do." Boone was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way he nodded when something landed right. "I'll call the lumberyard in the morning." "It is morning." "Then I'll call them in an hour." They left the hospital at 9. The sun was up, thin, watery, filtered through clouds that were breaking apart in slow, ragged pieces, like something torn that was learning how to be whole again. The parking lot was wet, and the air was cold, and the mountains around Black Ridge rose on every side, still and ancient, indifferent to the small human catastrophe that had unfolded in their shadow. The ride back to the compound took 20 minutes. Cade rode slowly. Not from exhaustion, though the exhaustion was total, cellular, the kind that lived in the marrow, but because the road was beautiful in a way he hadn't noticed before. The curves, the trees, the way the morning light hit the wet asphalt and turned it silver. He'd ridden this road 100 times and never seen it. He'd been too busy disappearing. The compound looked worse in daylight. The workshop was a blackened shell, steel ribs exposed, roof collapsed, the concrete floor visible through gaps in the walls like the exposed bones of something that had been alive and wasn't anymore. Tools were melted, fused, unrecognizable. The workbench where Cade had spent 3 years rebuilding carburetors and replacing brake lines and doing the quiet, repetitive work of a man who needed his hands busy so his mind could rest, gone, all of it. But the clubhouse was standing. Boone had been right. The walls were intact. The roof was intact. The door was on its hinges. Inside, the overturned table had been righted. Gravel, probably, sometime during the early morning hours, because Gravel was the kind of man who put things back where they belonged even when the world around them was on fire. The broken table leg had been splinted with a piece of rebar and wrapped in duct tape. It was ugly. It held. Dutch was asleep on the couch, his prosthetic still attached, his battered face relaxed into something that approximated peace. Gravel was at the table, drinking coffee from a tin mug, his splinted hand wrapped around it carefully. He looked up when Cade and Boone entered. His expression didn't change. Gravel's expression never changed, but his eyes moved between them with the quick, assessing gaze of a medic checking vitals. "You're both upright," he said. "That's something." Boone sat down heavily in a folding chair. The metal groaned under him. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands and stayed that way for a full minute, breathing slowly, the way a man breathes when he's allowing himself, for the first time in 12 hours, to stop. Cade poured coffee. It was terrible. Burnt, bitter, thick as motor oil. He drank it standing, leaning against the workbench that was no longer there. Leaning instead against a bare wall with a rectangle of slightly less faded paint where something had once hung and been taken down. He drank the coffee, and it was the best thing he'd ever tasted, because he was alive to taste it, and the girl was safe and the sun was up. His phone buzzed. A text from Roach. "Torres confirmed. Shaw's hard drives decrypted. Full network exposed. 31 victims identified across 4 states. Arrest warrants issued for 9 additional suspects. Maryland facility rated at OH730. Foundation assets frozen." Cade read it twice. Set the phone down. Picked up his coffee. 31 children. Some of them would have families to return to. Some would not. Some would spend years in therapy and foster care, in systems that were imperfect and underfunded, and sometimes cruel in their own bureaucratic way. The damage was done. No arrest could undo it. No conviction could unbreak what had been broken. But the machine had been stopped. The building was empty. The doors were open. And 31 names that had been reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet were names again. That was not nothing. 3 days later, Cade stood outside Harlan's diner at the edge of Blackridge, drinking coffee from a paper cup. The autumn afternoon was doing the thing he'd noticed the day Lily first crossed the street, getting darker too early, the sky pulling its light back like a hand retreating from a flame. The same blinking yellow traffic light at the corner of Main and Ridgeway still wasn't working. The same dog sat by the same parking meter. The town looked the same. But it wasn't. The Blackridge Community Foundation had been shut down by federal order. Its offices were sealed. Its board members were in custody or awaiting arraignment. The elementary school was closed for investigation, and the playground, the stretch of mulch and broken equipment built on land donated by a shell company to cover the bones of its own crimes, was cordoned off with yellow tape that flapped in the wind like a flag for a country that no longer existed. The local paper had run the story, then the regional papers, then the wire services, then the national outlets. Blackridge, the town where nothing happened, was suddenly the town where everything had happened, and the citizens who walked its streets did so with the specific shell-shocked gait of people who had just learned that the ground beneath their feet was not solid and never had been. Some of them were angry at the foundation, at the police, at the systems that had failed. Some of them were ashamed because they'd known the men on the board, had voted for them, had trusted them, had sat across from them at town meetings and PTA gatherings and never once suspected. And some of them, a small number but growing, came to the Ironvale compound on the gravel road 3 miles outside town, and they brought things: lumber, tools, boxes of nails, a welding torch still in its packaging, a coffee maker, new, with a bow on it that someone had clearly added as an afterthought. They didn't ask to come inside. They left the materials by the gate and drove away. Some left notes. Most didn't. It was the language of a community that didn't know how to say what it needed to say, but understood that silence was no longer an option. Dutch organized the rebuilding. His engineering background, mechanical, structural, precise, turned the charred workshop into a project with phases and timelines and material lists written in his cramped, angular handwriting on sheets of plywood leaning against the clubhouse wall. Gravel did the heavy lifting, his splinted hand wrapped in a work glove, moving steel beams and concrete blocks with the methodical patience of a man who understood that repair was a form of meditation. Roach ran the electrical. He'd taught himself wiring during his intelligence career, a skill that translated surprisingly well from surveillance equipment to workshop circuits. And Boone supervised, which mostly meant standing with his arms crossed, drinking coffee, and telling everyone they were doing it wrong until they did it right. Cade worked on the bay doors. He worked slowly, deliberately, fitting each panel into its track with the care of a man who understood that the thing being built was not just a workshop. It was a statement, a refusal to be erased. The fire had taken the structure. It had not taken the men who built it. On the 4th day, Lily came to the compound. Karen Bennett drove her in a dented Honda Civic that sounded like it needed a timing belt. They pulled up to the gate and sat in the car for a moment, mother and daughter, looking at the construction in progress. The new steel frame rising from the charred foundation, the 4 men working in the cold air, the motorcycles parked in a row outside the clubhouse like soldiers at rest. Lily got out of the car. She was wearing a new coat, properly sized, properly zipped, and her hair was brushed. She walked through the gate with the same directness she'd shown the day she crossed the street, outside Harlan's diner, the same unshakable, straight-line courage that had started everything. Cade saw her from the bay. He set down his drill, walked to meet her. They stood in the gravel, face to face, the tall, scarred man and the small, unbowed girl, and for a moment neither spoke, because the space between them was filled with something that didn't require language. "I brought you something," Lily said. She held out a fresh envelope. White, clean, unsealed. Cade took it, opened it. Inside was a drawing, crayon on white paper, the kind of paper from a school art room. It showed 2 figures standing beside a motorcycle beneath a sky filled with orange and yellow and pink, a sunrise rendered in the bold, unsubtle strokes of an 11-year-old's hand. One figure was tall, wearing a black jacket. The other was small, wearing a coat that actually fit. Both figures were smiling. Between them, on the ground, was a tiny rectangle that might have been an envelope. Cade turned it over. On the back, in careful pencil letters. Sometimes the bravest people aren't the ones who hide secrets. They're the ones who open the envelope. He stood there for a long time, holding the drawing. The wind blew through the compound, carrying the smell of new lumber and old concrete and coffee from the clubhouse and exhaust from the motorcycles and the distant, fading scent of smoke from a fire that had gone out days ago but whose ghost still lingered in the air. He didn't cry. Cade Mercer didn't cry. He hadn't cried when the satellite phone rang in Kandahar. He hadn't cried at the memorial. He hadn't cried in 3 years of silence in a town where he'd come to disappear. But his eyes burned, and his throat closed, and his hands, those scarred, swollen, crooked-fingered hands that had held weapons and wrenches and steering grips and the body of a sleeping girl carried out of a concrete room, trembled as they held a piece of paper with a crayon sunrise and 2 smiling figures and a truth so simple that only a child could have written it. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough and broken and barely audible above the wind. Lily looked up at him. "Are you going to leave?" The question was direct, the way all of her questions were. No preamble, no softening. The naked inquiry of a child who had learned that adults leave, fathers leave, teachers betray, systems fail, and who needed to know, before she allowed herself to trust one more time, whether this one would stay. Cade looked at the compound, at Dutch measuring a steel beam with a carpenter's square, at Gravel carrying cinder blocks with his splinted hand, at Roach threading electrical wire through a conduit, his hand steady, his eyes clear. At Boone standing by the clubhouse door with his arms crossed and his coffee cup balanced on the railing and his face turned toward the sun that was breaking through the clouds for the first time in days. He looked at the drawing in his hand, at the 2 figures beside the motorcycle, at the sunrise. "No," he said. "I'm not going to leave." Lily nodded. Not a child's nod, a soldier's nod. The nod of someone who had been through a war and come out the other side and was now assessing the landscape for signs of permanence. "Good," she said, "because the workshop needs a lot of work, and I'm pretty good with a paintbrush." Cade looked at her. And for the first time in 10 years, for the first time since a phone call in a Humvee in a desert on the other side of the world, he smiled. Not the almost smile from the bench outside the diner, not the controlled, guarded approximation of warmth that he'd learned to deploy when social situations required it. A real smile. Full. Unguarded. The smile of a man who had finally stopped running from something and started building toward something, and who understood, standing in the gravel with a crayon drawing in his hand and a child looking up at him with eyes that held no fear, that the 2 things were the same. "Then let's get you a paintbrush," he said. Lily grinned. She walked past him toward the workshop, toward the men, toward the sound of drills and hammers and conversation and the low, steady rumble of a motorcycle engine that someone, Roach probably, had started in the bay. The deep percussive heartbeat of a machine that was being rebuilt from the ground up. The way everything in Blackridge was being rebuilt from the ground up. Not because the damage hadn't happened, but because the people who remained had decided that the damage was not the end of the story. Karen Bennett watched from the car. She didn't get out. She sat behind the wheel with her hands in her lap and her eyes on her daughter, walking through a compound of bikers and veterans and broken men who had burned their own safety to the ground to keep one child alive. And something on her face shifted. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the precursor to trust. The recognition that the world, despite every piece of evidence to the contrary, still contained people who would stand between a child and the dark. Cade watched Lily disappear into the workshop. Then he walked to the Softail, parked at the end of the row, and opened his toolbox. The photograph was still there, taped to the inside of the lid, faded, curling at the edges. A boy in a baseball cap standing in front of a blue house. Emmett, 7 years old, smiling the way children smile when they don't yet know that the world contains people who would build playgrounds over buried crimes. Cade looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he took the crayon drawing from Lily and placed it beside the photograph. Not on top of it, not replacing it, but next to it, the 2 images side by side inside the toolbox lid, the way the past and the present exist side by side inside a man who has learned that carrying grief does not mean being buried by it. He closed the toolbox, picked up his drill, walked back to the bay doors. The afternoon light was golden now, slanting through the broken clouds at a low angle that turned the wet compound into something almost beautiful. Steam rose from the gravel where the sun hit the puddles. The motorcycles gleamed. Somewhere inside the workshop, Lily was asking Gravel about the brass ring on his leather cord, and Gravel was actually answering in full sentences, more words than he'd spoken in a day and months, and his voice carried through the open bay door like something long sealed being finally allowed to breathe. Cade fitted the last panel into the bay door track. Tested it. The door slid open and closed with a smooth, even motion. Tight, balanced, right. He stepped back and looked at it, and behind it, at the workshop taking shape around the new steel frame, at the men and the girl working inside it, at the tools hung on fresh pegboard, and the concrete floor swept clean, and the coffee maker, the new one with the bow, sitting on a shelf by the door, already plugged in, already brewing. He turned and looked at the road. Route 12 stretched east and west, disappearing in both directions into the hills and the trees and the distance. It was the same road he'd arrived on 3 years ago, running from everything. It was the same road he could leave on now. He didn't leave. He picked up a wrench, walked into the workshop, and went to work. Beside his brothers, beside a girl with a paintbrush, inside a building that had been burned to the ground and was rising again because 4 broken men and 1 brave child had decided that some things were worth the fire. Outside, the sun continued to set behind the ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep, bruised purple. The blinking traffic light on Main and Ridgeway still didn't work. The dog by the parking meter had gone home. The town of Black Ridge was quiet in the way that towns are quiet after storms, not the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness. The stillness of a place that had looked at the worst thing inside itself and had not looked away. And on a scarred workbench in a half-rebuilt workshop 3 miles outside of town, a toolbox sat open, its lid propped against the wall, displaying 2 images side by side, a faded photograph of a boy who would never grow up, and a crayon drawing of a sunrise that a girl had given to a man who had finally learned that the bravest thing he would ever do was not ride into the dark. It was stay.